There is something almost sacred about the oldest objects we keep, the ones that survive not because they are precious metals or jewels, but because they were made for joy, for wonder, for the simple pleasure of a child's hands. Toys have traveled with us through every age, from the earliest moments of human civilization to this very evening, and in their quiet persistence, in their presence across millennia, they tell us something profound about what it means to be human, about imagination, about the way we learn to understand the world through play. I find myself thinking tonight about all the children who have ever lived, about the universal impulse to create something small and manageable, something that fits in young hands, something that moves or rolls or transforms, and how that impulse crosses every boundary we might imagine, every culture, every century, every corner of the earth. The story of toys is not merely a catalogue of objects, it is a chronicle of human creativity at its most tender, most hopeful, because when we make toys, we are not building monuments or weapons or tools of survival. We are building doorways into wonder. We are saying that childhood matters, that imagination deserves materials, that play itself is worth preserving. And so tonight I find myself wandering through this long and gentle history, through archaeological sites and ancient cities, through medieval workshops and industrial factories, through the hands of craftspeople and the hearts of parents, all of them connected by this single thread, the desire to give children something beautiful to hold. The earliest toys we know of are so old that they predate writing itself. They come from times when human civilization was still finding its footing, still learning to plant crops and build permanent homes, and yet already there were small carved animals, small wheeled carts, small dolls with movable limbs. Already there was this understanding that children needed more than food and shelter. They needed objects that sparked something in the mind. Archaeologists have found these ancient playthings in the ruins of cities that vanished thousands of years ago, in the tombs of Egypt and the settlements of Mesopotamia, in the Indus Valley and along the Yellow River. And what strikes me most powerfully is how recognizable they are, how a wooden horse carved 4,000 years ago would still be understood instantly by a child today, how the imagination works in patterns that time cannot erase. There is something deeply moving about holding the idea of these objects in mind, about imagining a child in ancient Thebes, in Ur, in Mohenjo-Daro, reaching for a toy that their parent had carved or sewn or shaped from clay. The same reaching motion that children make now, the same delight in something made just for them. The materials were simple, wood and clay and bone and fabric, whatever the earth offered and human hands could shape, but the intentions were sophisticated. Already these ancient toy makers understood proportion and balance, understood that a doll should have a face to speak to, that a cart should have wheels that actually turn, that a ball should be round enough to roll true. And as I let my mind wander through these early centuries, I notice how toys became part of ritual, part of ceremony, how they were sometimes placed in tombs to accompany children into whatever came next, how they were offerings to gods, how they marked the boundary between childhood and adulthood in cultures that celebrated that transition with gift-giving and symbolic objects. But mostly they were simply there, in homes and courtyards and market squares, being pulled along dusty streets, being clutched during long journeys, being passed from older siblings to younger ones, being mended when they broke because they mattered, because a beloved toy was not disposable, it was a companion. I think about the universality of certain forms. The doll appears everywhere humans have lived, in every material imaginable, because children everywhere have needed something to nurture, something to project their understanding of human relationships onto. Dolls were mothers and babies and friends and strangers. They were as complex as the children who played with them, and animals, carved animals, clay animals, animals on wheels or animals that could be pulled on strings, because children live so close to the animal world, because understanding animals meant understanding survival and danger and companionship, and because animals in miniature were somehow more approachable, more knowable than the living creatures that towered over small bodies. The ancient world was full of noise and labor and uncertainty, and yet within that world there was space carved out for these small objects, space in the household economy, space in the artisan's workshop, space in the child's day for play, for imagination, for the kind of learning that happens when a mind is free to explore. And so the story begins here, in these earliest moments, when humanity first decided that childhood deserved its own objects, its own beauty, its own dedicated space in the material world, when the first toy maker, whose name we will never know, carved or shaped or stitched something and placed it in a child's hands and watched what happened next. The ancient Greeks and Romans carried this tradition forward, expanding it, refining it, turning toy making into something closer to a craft. And in the markets of Athens and the streets of Rome, there were vendors who sold nothing but playthings, small workshops dedicated entirely to the production of objects meant for children's hands. In Greece, where philosophy and mathematics flourished, where the human mind was celebrated as something worth cultivating, toys became more sophisticated, more thoughtfully designed. There were yo-yos made of terracotta, perfectly weighted clay discs connected by cord, and the physics of their motion, the way they spun and returned, was already understood, already being engineered into objects meant for play. There were articulated dolls with jointed limbs, tiny bronze and clay figures whose arms and legs could be moved into different positions, positioned into tableaux, into stories. And I find myself imagining the child who first discovered that these limbs could bend, who understood suddenly that this small figure could dance, could fight, could embrace another doll, could become anything the imagination required. The wealthy families of Rome commissioned elaborate doll houses, miniature furniture carved from ivory and precious woods, tiny bronze cooking vessels, little oil lamps that actually worked, entire domestic worlds recreated in scale. And these were not crude approximations. They were precise reproductions. They taught children about the adult world they would inherit, about household management and social hierarchy, about the objects that defined civilized life. But toys were not only for the wealthy. Even in the poorest households, there were simple balls made of rags stitched together, wooden tops that could be spun with string, dolls fashioned from corn husks or scraps of fabric, because the impulse to give children something to play with transcended economic class. It was fundamental. It was universal. Roman children played with wooden swords, with hobby horses, with small carts pulled by mice or birds trained for the purpose. And in the archaeological record we find gaming pieces, knucklebones used for games of chance, marbles made of clay or stone or glass, evidence of play that was social, competitive, rule-bound. The Roman writer Horace mentioned toys in his poetry, described gold and silver toys as examples of wealthy excess, but also acknowledged that all children, regardless of station, engaged in similar forms of play, built similar structures from whatever materials they could find, and acted similar dramas with whatever figures they possessed. And as the Roman Empire spread across Europe and the Mediterranean, toys traveled with it. Designs were shared. Techniques were exchanged. A doll style from Egypt might influence a craftsman in Gaul. A ball-making method from Greece might appear in Britain. Toys became part of the complex web of cultural transmission that empires create. When Rome fell, when the ancient world gave way to medieval Europe, toys did not disappear. They changed. They adapted to new economic realities, to new social structures, to new materials and new markets. In medieval Europe, childhood itself was understood differently. Children were seen as small adults, expected to contribute to household labor from an early age. And yet there were still toys, still objects made specifically for play, still evidence that even in harsh times, even in periods of great uncertainty, the impulse to nurture childhood remained. Medieval toys were often simple, wooden dolls with painted faces, small carved animals, leather balls stuffed with hair or wool, but they were lovingly made, carefully preserved, sometimes even mentioned in wills and estate inventories, which tells us they had value, emotional, if not monetary, that they were considered worth passing down. The medieval period gave us hobby horses, those simple stick horses that children could ride, galloping through castle courtyards or village squares, imitating the knights and nobles they saw around them. And the hobby horse endured for centuries, adapted across cultures, remained a staple of childhood play because it offered transformation. It turned a child into a rider, into someone powerful and mobile. Craftsmen's guilds began to form, and among them were guilds of toy makers, specialized artisans who dedicated their skills to creating playthings. In Nuremberg, in particular, toy making became a serious trade, a recognized profession, and the city became famous throughout Europe for the quality and variety of its toys. Nuremberg toy makers worked in wood and tin and pewter. They created elaborate Noah's Arks filled with pairs of carved animals. They made miniature kitchens with functional doors and drawers. They produced soldiers and knights cast in metal, painted with careful detail, and these toys were exported across Europe, carried by merchants to markets in distant cities. The Noah's Ark became especially significant because it was a toy that religious families could justify. It taught biblical stories. It familiarized children with Scripture. And yet, it was also simply delightful. A boat filled with animals, a world in miniature, a story that could be enacted and reenacted endlessly. In Asia, meanwhile, toy traditions were developing along different lines, following different aesthetic principles, employing different materials and techniques, creating objects that reflected different cultural values and different understandings of childhood. In China, kites had been flown for centuries, not only as toys, but as tools of warfare and communication, but in children's hands they became pure play, became experiments in wind and balance, became dragons and birds dancing in the sky, and the craft of kite-making became sophisticated, involving paper and silk and bamboo, requiring understanding of aerodynamics, even if that knowledge was intuitive rather than scientific. Chinese children played with diabolos, those hourglass-shaped spinning toys manipulated on a string, requiring skill and practice and coordination, and with shadow puppets, intricate figures cut from leather or paper, whose stories were projected onto screens, whose movements taught narrative, taught cause and effect, taught the power of performance. In Japan, toys were often connected to festivals, to seasonal celebrations. There were battledores and shuttlecocks for the new year, daruma dolls that represented perseverance and good fortune, kokeshi dolls with their simple, limbless bodies and oversized heads, each region developing its own style, its own painting techniques, its own symbolic meanings. Japanese toy makers understood negative space, understood simplicity as a form of sophistication. Their toys were often minimal in detail, but maximum in suggestion, allowing the child's imagination to complete what the object implied. And this aesthetic, this restraint, created toys that were both beautiful objects and open invitations to creative play. In India, toys were made from clay and papier-mâché and wood. There were elaborate temple toys, toys that moved when strings were pulled, toys that demonstrated mechanical principles. There were small kitchens and cooking sets because cooking was sacred, was ritualistic, was worth reproducing in miniature for children to explore. And across the Islamic world, from Spain to Persia to North Africa, there were toys that reflected the mathematical and artistic sophistication of Islamic culture. Geometric puzzles, intricate carved wooden balls within balls, toys that taught pattern and proportion, that embedded learning within play. What strikes me as I move through these centuries, through these different cultures, is how seriously adults took the work of making toys, how much skill was invested, how much thought. These were not afterthoughts or crude approximations. They were crafted objects. They represented the best work that artisans could offer, and the materials mattered. Wood had to be chosen carefully, had to be carved with attention to grain and strength. Clay had to be properly fired. Paint had to be non-toxic and durable, because these objects would be handled roughly, would be chewed on and dropped and dragged through dirt. They had to withstand the enthusiasm of childhood. By the Renaissance, as wealth increased, as trade routes expanded, as cities grew and merchant classes emerged, toys became more elaborate, more diverse, more widely available. The aristocratic families of Europe filled their nurseries with mechanical marvels, with automata that could move and make sounds, with expensive imported dolls dressed in the latest fashions. But even as luxury toys proliferated, even as some toys became status symbols, demonstrations of wealth and sophistication, the fundamental forms persisted. Children still played with balls and dolls and animals, still built towers from wooden blocks, still enacted the same basic narratives of family and adventure and transformation. The printing press, invented in the mid-1500s, eventually gave rise to printed paper toys, to books designed specifically for children, to paper dolls and paper theaters that could be cut out and assembled. And this democratized toys in a new way, made them reproducible, made them affordable for families who could never commission carved wooden toys from master craftsmen. And throughout all of this, throughout all these centuries and cultures and innovations, children were doing what children have always done. They were playing. They were learning through manipulation and experimentation. They were creating worlds within worlds. They were practicing being human, and the toys were their tools, their props, their companions in that essential work. The 17th and 18th centuries saw the rise of educational toys as Enlightenment thinking emphasized reason and learning, as childhood began to be understood as a distinct phase of life that deserved protection and cultivation. Toys were designed to teach geography, to teach letters and numbers, to teach moral lessons through play. Puzzle maps appeared, wooden jigsaws that taught the shapes of countries and continents, alphabet blocks with letters carved or printed on their sides, toys that had explicit pedagogical purposes, but were still fundamentally toys, still objects of delight and manipulation, and dolls became more realistic, more detailed. Doll makers in France and Germany created porcelain-headed dolls with glass eyes and real hair, dolls that could be dressed and undressed, that came with wardrobes and accessories, that allowed children to practice the social rituals they observed in adult life. The Industrial Revolution was approaching, waiting just ahead in the timeline, ready to transform everything about how toys were made and distributed and understood. But before that transformation, there was this long period, these thousands of years, when toys were handmade, when each one was unique, when toy making was a craft passed down through generations of artisans who understood wood and clay and fabric, who understood children, who understood play, and then the machines came and everything changed. Not all at once, not overnight, but gradually, relentlessly, as the Industrial Revolution spread across Europe and America, as factories rose and production methods transformed, as the handmade gave way to the manufactured. The first toy factories appeared in Germany in the early 1800s, in the Thuringian forest region, where families had been carving wooden toys for generations, and these families began to organize their work differently, to specialize, to create assembly lines where one person carved heads, another carved bodies, another painted faces, and suddenly production increased tenfold, 20-fold. Nuremberg remained at the center of this transformation, its toy makers embracing new materials, new techniques. Tin became a favored medium because it could be stamped and cut and soldered, because it could be painted with bright enamels, because it was cheaper than wood and lighter than cast metal. The tin toy, with its characteristic sound, that hollow rattle when shaken, became the sound of 19th century childhood. Tin soldiers marching in formation, tin carriages with turning wheels, tin animals painted in colors that nature never intended, bright reds and blues and yellows that caught the eye, that announced themselves as objects of joy rather than representations of reality. Mechanical toys emerged, wind-up mechanisms adapted from clockwork, toys that could move on their own, that could walk or hop or spin, and the wonder of a toy that moved without being pushed, that contained its own energy, its own animation, was profound. It was almost magical. It suggested life where there was only spring and gears. French toy makers became famous for their automata, for mechanical dolls that could write or draw or play music. These were expensive, often too expensive for children to actually play with. They became drawing room curiosities, demonstrations of mechanical ingenuity, but they inspired simpler versions, wind-up toys that children could afford, that could perform simple repetitive motions, a bear that drummed, a bird that pecked, and as factories grew, as production scaled, toys became more affordable, more accessible. Middle-class families could now fill their nurseries with variety, could buy new toys for birthdays and holidays, could replace broken toys rather than mending them. And this shift, this abundance, changed the relationship between children and their playthings. The Victorian era, with its particular attitudes toward childhood, its emphasis on moral education and proper behavior, produced toys that reflected these values. There were toy theaters that enacted improving stories. There were board games that taught virtues and punished vices. There were dolls and dollhouses that modeled idealized domestic life. But there were also trains, those glorious miniature railways that captured the imagination of the age. Because trains were the future. Trains were power and speed and connection. Trains were transforming the world. And in miniature, they became accessible, became controllable, became something a child could master. The first toy trains were simple push toys, wooden or tin locomotives that rolled on wheels, but soon there were clockwork trains, then steam-powered trains that actually ran on real steam, tiny boilers heated by real flames, dangerous and thrilling and absolutely captivating, and eventually electric trains running on metal tracks, controlled by switches and signals, entire miniature worlds of rail transport. Germany dominated toy train production through the late 1800s. Companies like Marklin created trains of extraordinary detail and quality, trains that were scale models of real locomotives, that came with stations and signals and bridges that could be assembled into complex layouts. And these weren't just toys. They were hobbies. They were collections. They were systems that could be expanded year after year. In America, the toy industry was developing its own character, its own innovations. American toy makers embraced cast iron, heavy durable metals that could be molded into intricate shapes. Cast iron banks became popular. Mechanical banks where a coin would trigger an action, a figure would move, a door would open. Saving money became a game, became entertainment. American toys were often more robust, built for rough play, built to survive the frontier spirit. There were cast iron fire engines and horse-drawn wagons. There were cap guns and toy rifles. There were building sets made from metal strips and bolts. Early versions of construction toys that taught mechanical principles through assembly. The teddy bear arrived in 1902, simultaneously in America and Germany, inspired by President Theodore Roosevelt's refusal to shoot a captured bear, and the timing was somehow perfect. The world was ready for a soft toy bear, for something cuddly and comforting rather than educational or mechanical. Margaret Steiff in Germany had been making stuffed animals, had developed a jointed bear design, and Morris Mictom in America created his own version, and suddenly every child wanted a bear. The teddy bear became perhaps the most successful toy design in history, enduring across generations, across cultures, becoming so fundamental to childhood that it's hard to imagine a time before them. The early 1900s saw an explosion of innovation, new materials, new manufacturing processes, new understandings of child development and play, Celluloid allowed for lightweight dolls with detailed features. Composition materials created durable doll bodies. Rubber-made balls that bounced higher and toys that were waterproof. Dolls became increasingly sophisticated. They could cry. They could wet themselves. They could close their eyes when laid down, each innovation bringing them closer to real babies, making them better tools for nurturing play, for the practice of caregiving that was considered essential for girls of that era. And the division became more pronounced. Toys for boys, toys for girls, blue and pink, aggressive and nurturing, construction and domesticity. The toy industry began to market specifically to these categories to reinforce gender roles through play, building sets and toy soldiers for boys, dolls and kitchen sets for girls. Meccano appeared in 1901, invented by Frank Hornby in England, a metal construction system with strips and plates and gears and wheels. And it was revolutionary. It wasn't a toy that did something. It was a toy that could become anything. A crane today, a bridge tomorrow, a car next week. It taught engineering principles, taught problem solving, taught the satisfaction of building something complex from simple parts. In Denmark, a carpenter named Ole Kirk Christiansen was beginning to make wooden toys in his workshop, simple pull toys and yo-yos, well-crafted pieces that reflected Scandinavian design principles, clean lines, natural materials, quality construction. He named his company Lego, from the Danish phrase leg god, meaning play well. And though the plastic bricks that would make the company famous were still decades away, the philosophy was already there, the belief that good play required good tools. The years between the two world wars were difficult. Economies struggled, families had less to spend, but toy companies adapted. They made toys cheaper, simpler. They used less metal, more paper and cardboard. They created toys that could be manufactured quickly and sold for pennies rather than dollars. And children played through depression and hardship. Children played because play is not optional. It's not a luxury that disappears when times are hard. It's fundamental. It's how children process the world, how they practice being alive. And so families found ways, made toys from scraps and cast-offs, created playthings from imagination and necessity. The Second World War disrupted everything. Factories that had made toys now made munitions. Metal that would have become toy soldiers became real weapons, and many toy companies shuttered or pivoted entirely to war production. Childhood continued, but childhood's material culture shrank, became more precious, became something to be preserved and protected. But when the war ended, when soldiers returned home and families rebuilt, there was a boom, an explosion of births and optimism and consumption. The baby boom generation arrived, and with them came unprecedented demand for toys, for everything, for newness and abundance and delight. And the toy industry responded. Factories retooled. New companies emerged. Plastics, those miracle materials developed during the war, became the medium of the new era, cheap, colorful, moldable into any shape, durable enough to survive childhood, light enough to be safe. Barbie appeared in 1959, created by Ruth Handler, inspired by her daughter's imaginative play with paper dolls. And Barbie was different. She wasn't a baby doll to nurture. She was an adult figure, a teenage fashion model with an extensive wardrobe, with careers and accessories and eventually friends and family, and she became controversial, became culturally significant, became a mirror reflecting changing attitudes toward femininity and aspiration. Hot Wheels launched in 1968. Tiny die-cast cars designed to race on plastic tracks, cars with low-friction wheels that could achieve remarkable speeds, cars decorated with wild graphics and custom paint jobs, and suddenly boys were collecting, trading, racing, building elaborate track systems, and the simple joy of a fast, small car became an empire. Lego introduced the plastic brick in 1949, but it wasn't until 1958 that they patented the stud and tube coupling system, the design that allowed bricks to clutch together with just the right amount of force, strong enough to build tall structures, gentle enough for small hands to separate. And this was genius. This was a toy system that scaled infinitely, that could be as simple or as complex as the builder desired. The construction toy, in its various forms, represented something profound about mid-century optimism, the belief that the world could be built, that problems could be solved through engineering, that children should learn to create rather than simply consume. And so there were Lincoln Logs and Tinker Toys and Erector sets, all offering different approaches to the same fundamental activity: building, creating, making something from nothing. Action figures arrived in 1964 with G.I. Joe, dolls for boys. Though they were never called dolls, they were action figures. Soldiers with articulated joints and military equipment, and they opened a new market, proved that boys would engage in narrative play with figures if those figures represented action and adventure rather than domesticity. Electronic toys began to appear, battery-powered mechanisms that could move and light up and make sounds. Transistor radios became toys. Walkie-talkies allowed long-distance play, and the boundary between toy and technology began to blur, began to suggest futures where play might involve computers, might involve screens, might involve entirely new forms of interaction. Board games flourished. Monopoly and Scrabble from earlier decades were joined by Risk and Stratego and dozens of others. Games became family rituals, became ways of spending time together, teaching strategy and chance and competition, and the game closet became a fixture of middle-class homes, a library of different rule systems, different worlds to enter. And then came the screens, first small, flickering cathode ray tubes running simple programs, games that were barely more than moving dots and lines, but they were interactive. They responded to input. They created feedback loops that were immediate and compelling, and children were drawn to them with an intensity that concerned parents and delighted manufacturers. Pong appeared in 1972, a game so simple it seems almost absurd now. 2 paddles, a bouncing square, and yet it captivated. It demonstrated that electronic play could be engaging, could be competitive, could fill hours with repetitive action that felt somehow fresh each time. The late 1970s brought home gaming consoles, Atari and others, cartridge-based systems that could play multiple games, and suddenly the television, that screen that had been passive, that had broadcast stories created by others, became interactive, became a space where children could make choices, could control outcomes, could play, and traditional toys continued. They didn't disappear, but they began to share space with these new forms, began to compete for attention, began to adapt, Many toys incorporated electronic elements, dolls that spoke, cars that responded to remote controls, board games with electronic timers and random number generators. Star Wars arrived in 1977, and with it came a merchandising phenomenon that changed the toy industry forever. Action figures representing every character, vehicles and play sets, an entire universe recreated in plastic. And children didn't just want one figure, they wanted to collect them all, wanted to recreate scenes, wanted to extend the story beyond the screen. The concept of the media tie-in became dominant. Toys were no longer standalone objects. They were extensions of stories told elsewhere, on television, in movies, in comic books. And this created powerful synergies. The story sold the toy reinforced the story. Children lived inside these narratives, carried them from screen to floor to playground. Transformers launched in 1984. Toys that were two things at once. Robots that became vehicles, vehicles that became robots, and the transformation itself. The puzzle of converting one form to another became the play, became the satisfaction. And there was a television show, a story, a mythology. But the toys stood alone, were engaging even without the narrative context. Cabbage Patch Kids created a frenzy in 1983. Soft-bodied dolls with yarn hair and unique faces, each one supposedly different, each one coming with adoption papers. And parents lined up, fought in stores, paid inflated prices because their children wanted these specific dolls, wanted to participate in this particular craze, and the psychology of scarcity and uniqueness was revealed, was exploited, was understood as a powerful force. The toy industry had become enormous. Multinational corporations with research departments and focus groups, with sophisticated marketing campaigns aimed directly at children through Saturday morning cartoons, with planned obsolescence and annual model changes. The innocence of the wooden toy workshop was centuries gone, replaced by boardrooms and market analysis and profit margins. But creativity persisted. Small companies still innovated, still created toys that were genuinely novel. The Rubik's Cube appeared in 1980, a puzzle that could be solved but rarely was, that frustrated and fascinated in equal measure, that became a global phenomenon because it was perfectly calibrated, difficult enough to be challenging, simple enough to be approachable. Electronic learning toys emerged, computers designed for children, teaching typing and math and spelling through games, and parents bought them eagerly, hoping that early exposure to computers would provide advantages, would prepare their children for futures that were clearly going to be dominated by technology. The 1990s brought virtual pets, Tamagotchis, digital creatures that lived in small plastic eggs, that required feeding and attention, that would die if neglected, and children carried them everywhere, checked on them constantly, learned about responsibility through the demands of a simulated life. Beanie Babies became a collecting obsession, small stuffed animals filled with plastic pellets, marketed with artificial scarcity, with retirement announcements out with the suggestion that they might be valuable, might be investments, and adults collected alongside children. Prices soared, and the bubble eventually burst. But for a few years they demonstrated the power of collectability, of manufactured desire. The internet changed everything, slowly at first, then rapidly. Online games appeared, multiplayer worlds where children could interact with others across distances, where play became social in new ways, where the playground extended infinitely beyond physical boundaries. Traditional toy companies struggled to adapt. Some failed. Some were absorbed by larger corporations. Some found niches, specialty markets, collector markets. The mass market fragmented. Children's attention fragmented. A child in 2000 had options that would have been unimaginable to a child in 1950. Hundreds of cable channels, video games with photorealistic graphics, websites and early social networks, and traditional toys competing for space among all of these stimuli. But certain toys endured. Lego continued to thrive, adapting, creating licensed sets based on popular movies, creating robotic sets that taught programming, expanding while maintaining the core brick system that had worked for decades, proving that good fundamental design could survive technological change. Action figures evolved, became more articulated, more detailed, developed collector markets among adults. Toy companies realized that nostalgia was powerful, that adults would buy premium versions of toys they'd loved as children, and the line between children's toy and adult collectible blurred. Educational toys became more sophisticated, more research-based. Companies employed child development experts, designed toys that targeted specific skills, spatial reasoning, fine motor control, early literacy, and parents bought these toys hoping to give their children advantages, to optimize development, to ensure success in an increasingly competitive world. The 2000s brought smart toys, toys with chips and sensors, dolls that could recognize voices, robots that could be programmed, construction sets that incorporated motors and computers, and the integration of technology into traditional play patterns accelerated, became expected, became normal. Smartphones and tablets arrived. Touchscreens made computing accessible to even very young children. Apps designed for toddlers appeared, games that were educational, games that were purely entertaining, and screen time became a major parenting concern, became something to be limited, managed, negotiated. YouTube created a new phenomenon. Children watching other children play with toys, unboxing videos where the unwrapping itself became entertainment, and these videos garnered millions of views, influenced purchase decisions, created new categories of toy celebrity, children who became famous for playing. And through all of this, through all these changes and innovations and disruptions, certain fundamental forms persisted. Children still played with dolls, still built with blocks, still rolled balls, still created imaginary worlds with whatever materials were available. The screens and electronics and licensed properties were layers added on top of something ancient, something that predated civilization itself. The 2010s brought a renaissance of traditional toys, a reaction against screen time, against passive consumption. Parents sought out wooden toys again, simple toys, open-ended toys, toys that didn't beep or light up, that required imagination rather than batteries. And small companies emerged to meet this demand, creating beautiful handcrafted toys that echoed those earliest forms. STEM toys became a category: science and technology and engineering and mathematics, coding toys, chemistry sets redesigned for safety, robotics kits that were accessible, and the goal was explicit: to prepare children for futures in technical fields. to make learning feel like play, to collapse the boundary between education and entertainment. Collectible card games created communities, Pokemon and Magic and others, games that required strategy and deck building, that had competitive scenes and tournaments that children could grow into, could maintain interest in for years, developing expertise, building collections that had real monetary value, and fidget spinners swept through in 2017, simple bearings and weighted arms, toys that did almost nothing, that just spun, and they were everywhere for 6 months, then vanished. A perfect example of how virally a toy trend could spread in the age of social media, and how quickly it could fade. Slime became a phenomenon, homemade slime, tutorial videos showing different recipes, different colors and textures, and children were making their own toys, creating, experimenting, sharing results online. And this felt different, felt participatory, felt like a return to an earlier era when toys were often homemade, when creation was part of play. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted everything, closed stores, disrupted supply chains, locked children at home, and toy sales surged. Parents desperate to occupy homebound children, children desperate for new stimuli, and puzzles sold out, board games sold out, craft kits sold out, anything that could fill time, that could provide relief from screens and boredom and anxiety. And in that strange period, that time of isolation, the role of toys became clearer. They weren't just products, they were tools for emotional regulation, for learning, for maintaining some sense of a normalcy when the world had become abnormal. They were comforts, companions, anchors. As we arrive in the present moment in these current years, the toy landscape is extraordinarily diverse. There are toys incorporating artificial intelligence, toys that can learn and adapt, toys that blur the line between physical and digital. There are subscription boxes delivering curated toys monthly. There are minimalist toys designed by Scandinavian designers. There are mass-market licensed properties and handcrafted wooden heirlooms. Children today have access to more toys than any previous generation, more variety, more sophistication, more choice, and yet the fundamental activities remain: building and nurturing and pretending and competing, the same activities that children in ancient Egypt engaged in, the same impulses expressed through different materials, different technologies, different cultural contexts. And perhaps this is where the history becomes something more, becomes a lens for understanding what changes and what doesn't, what technologies can transform, and what remains essentially human, what all these objects across all these centuries were really doing, what they were really for. Because when we look at toys across this vast expanse of time, when we hold in our minds simultaneously the clay rattle from ancient Mesopotamia and the AI-powered robot of today, we begin to see something profound about human nature, about what we value, about what we protect even in the hardest times. Toys are not necessary for survival. They provide no calories, no shelter, no protection from predators or weather, and yet they appear in every culture, in every era, in households wealthy and poor, in times of peace and times of war. They persist because they serve something essential, something that transcends mere survival. They are tools for becoming human, for learning the skills that culture requires. But they are more than that. They are expressions of love, tangible manifestations of the desire to give children joy, to ease the difficulty of growing up, to provide small, manageable worlds where imagination can roam freely. When a parent in ancient Rome commissioned an ivory doll for their daughter, when a father in medieval Germany carved a wooden horse for his son, when a mother in 1950s America saved money to buy a teddy bear, they were all doing the same thing. They were saying that childhood matters, that play deserves resources, that their child's happiness was worth the effort, worth the cost. And the children who received these gifts across all these centuries experienced something similar, the delight of possession, of having something that was theirs, something made for their hands, their imagination, their particular way of understanding the world. The evolution of toys mirrors the evolution of human capability, from carved wood to molded plastic to programmed silicon. Each technological revolution was quickly adapted to the purpose of play, because adults recognized that children needed to grow up fluent in the materials and methods of their time. But beneath the technological change, beneath the shift from handcraft to mass production to digital integration, the fundamental activities remained constant. Children built structures and knocked them down. They nurtured dolls and stuffed animals. They enacted stories of adventure and conflict and resolution. They practiced being adults while still being children. Toys taught skills, but not always the skills they were designed to teach. A doll might teach nurturing, but it also taught storytelling and emotional processing. A construction set might teach engineering, but it also taught patience and problem solving and the satisfaction of completing difficult tasks. A ball taught physics through the body rather than through equations. And toys connected generations. Grandparents who remembered their own childhoods when they saw similar toys. Parents who bought the modern versions of toys they had loved. Children who discovered that play itself was timeless, that the joy of a toy that responded well to manipulation was the same joy their ancestors had felt. The industrialization of toy production made abundance possible, made variety accessible, but it also created new anxieties about materialism, about spoiled children, about the loss of imagination when toys became too specific, too prescribed in their use, too tied to external narratives, and these anxieties were not new. Roman moralists worried about excessive luxury in toys. Victorian parents fretted about idle play versus improving activities. Mid-century experts warned about television and passivity. Every generation has worried that the new forms of play were somehow corrupting, somehow less valuable than the play of their own childhood. But children have always adapted, have always found ways to play creatively with whatever they were given, have always subverted the intended use of toys, turning dolls into explorers, turning building blocks into characters, turning any object into whatever the game required. The genius of the best toys, the ones that endured across decades, was that they were open-ended. They didn't dictate their own use. A simple wooden block could be a building, a car, a phone, a piece of food, anything, and this openness allowed the child's imagination to lead, allowed play to be truly creative rather than merely imitative. And in our current moment, when toys can be infinitely complex, can respond to voice commands and learn patterns and connect to the internet, there is a recognition that simplicity still has value, that the most sophisticated toy is not necessarily the most valuable, that sometimes what a child needs is something as simple to project their complexity onto. The history of toys is inseparable from the history of childhood itself, from changing ideas about what children are, what they need, what they deserve. In eras when children were seen as miniature adults, toys reflected that. In eras when childhood was understood as sacred and vulnerable, toys became gentler, more protective, and toys marked transitions, the shift from childhood to adolescence, sometimes explicitly, dolls that were put away, toy soldiers packed into storage, sometimes naturally as interests changed, as peer groups became more important than solitary play, as the real world became more engaging than miniature versions of it. But many people never entirely stopped playing, kept collections, built elaborate model railways in their basements, assembled and painted miniature figures, played board games and video games. Because play itself is not something we outgrow. It's something we channel differently, something we disguise with words like hobby and recreation. But it's still play, still the same impulse to engage imaginatively with objects and rules and possibilities. The future of toys is uncertain. Technology will continue to evolve. Virtual reality and augmented reality and technologies not yet invented will create new forms of play, new ways of interacting, new experiences that blur physical and digital even further. But the fundamental human needs that toys address, the need for imagination and creativity and mastery and story, those needs are not changing. They are ancient. They are part of what makes us human. And so toys in some form will persist, will adapt, will continue to be there when children reach for them. And this brings us to the end of this long history, this journey from clay to silicon, from handcraft to algorithm, from the first toy maker whose name we will never know to the vast global industry of today. The story of toys is ultimately a story about care, about the human capacity to think beyond immediate survival, to invest time and skill and resources into objects whose only purpose is joy, is learning through delight, is the enrichment of childhood. Every toy ever made, from the crudest stick horse to the most sophisticated robot, represents someone's effort to give a child something good, something valuable, something that says your play matters. Your imagination deserves materials. Your becoming deserves support. And the children who played with these toys across all these millennia were all doing the same essential work. They were learning to be human, to navigate social relationships, to understand cause and effect, to imagine alternatives to what is, to create and destroy and create again. On a quiet evening, when the day's demands have faded, when there is space to think about such things, I find myself grateful for this history, for the toy makers and the parents and the children, for the persistence of play across every obstacle, for the recognition that childhood deserves beauty, deserves objects made with care, deserves joy. And I imagine all the toys that have ever existed, from the oldest clay rattle to the newest digital companion, arrayed somehow in a vast collection. And what they reveal together is not just technological progress, not just economic history, but something about human nature at its most hopeful, most generous, most oriented toward the future, because toys are fundamentally optimistic. They assume there will be a future for children to grow into. They assume that childhood deserves protection and enrichment. They assume that the next generation matters enough to invest in their development, their happiness, their becoming. And so the story of toys is the story of human hope, expressed in materials, in objects, in the gift of play itself, continuing through every age, adapting to every change, but fundamentally constant, fundamentally human, fundamentally about love made tangible in small things meant for small hands. The night grows deeper, the history settles, and somewhere a child is playing with something old or something new, with wood or plastic or light on a screen, and they are doing what children have always done. They are building worlds, practicing being alive, learning through joy, and the long tradition continues, the endless conversation between generations, the gift given forward, the recognition that childhood, with all its wonder and difficulty and potential, deserves toys, deserves play, deserves this particular form of care. And perhaps that is enough to have traced this line through time, to have seen the persistence of this simple, generous impulse to rest here at the end of the story, with the knowledge that tomorrow there will be more toys, more children, more play, more of this ancient, beautiful practice of making joy tangible, making imagination material, making childhood a little easier, a little richer, a little more full of wonder. The history is complete, the circle closes, and we can rest here in this quiet understanding that toys have always been with us and will continue to be, as long as there are children and adults who remember being children, and the shared recognition that play is sacred, that imagination deserves tools, that the work of becoming human begins with small objects held in small hands, in moments of delight, in the eternal present of play, where time dissolves and everything is possible, and the world is made new again and again and again. There is a kind of quiet that exists only in the presence of collected things, a stillness that settles over rooms where objects rest behind glass, where voices soften instinctively, and footsteps echo with a particular reverence that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I find myself thinking about these spaces tonight, these sanctuaries of memory and artifact, these buildings that stand in cities and towns across the world, holding within them the fragments of what humanity has made and lost and remembered and wondered about. Museums. The word itself feels weighty, substantial, like something you might hold in your palm and turn over slowly, examining its surfaces, its textures, the way light catches along its edges. Tonight, I want to walk through the story of these places to trace the long and winding path that led from ancient collections hidden in temple storerooms to the grand marble halls we know today, from private cabinets of curiosity to institutions dedicated to preserving everything from painted canvases to preserved butterflies, from fragments of pottery to the very bones of the earth itself. The air in a museum has a particular quality, doesn't it? A coolness, a measured humidity, the faint scent of old wood and stone, sometimes a trace of conservation chemicals, the nearly imperceptible hum of climate control systems working to keep everything at precisely the right temperature, the right moisture content, protecting what has been gathered. I imagine walking through empty galleries in the hours before dawn, when the guards make their rounds and the building breathes in the darkness, when artifacts sit in their cases with no eyes upon them, waiting, patient, as they have waited for decades, sometimes centuries. These spaces hold such strange contradictions. They are at once monuments to the past and thoroughly modern institutions. They are free and yet carefully controlled, open to all and yet governed by unspoken rules of behavior. They promise to show us the world and yet can only ever offer us the smallest fraction of what exists. The history of museums is not a simple story, not a straight line from then to now, but rather a tapestry woven from many threads, from the hoarding impulses of ancient rulers who filled storerooms with tribute and treasure, from the scholarly passions of Renaissance collectors who arranged shells and minerals in wooden cabinets, from the imperial ambitions of nations that sent ships to distant shores and brought back what they found there, from the democratic ideals of revolutionaries who believed that what had belonged to kings should belong to everyone. Tonight, as I trace this history, I want to move slowly, to linger over details, to imagine the textures and atmospheres of these collected spaces as they evolved across the centuries. I want to think about the first person who looked at an object, a painted vase, a carved stone, a pressed flower, and decided it should be kept, should be preserved, should be arranged alongside other objects for contemplation and study. I want to consider the impulse behind collection itself, the human desire to gather, to organize, to make sense of the world by assembling pieces of it in one place, to create order from chaos, to build little universes behind locked doors. And I want to follow this impulse forward through time, watching as it transformed, as private became public, as hoarding became scholarship, as wonder cabinets became institutions, as the very idea of what a museum could be and should be shifted and evolved. The museums we visit today, with their admission desks and gift shops, their audio guides and educational programs, their conservation laboratories and digital archives, these are the inheritors of a tradition that stretches back thousands of years. And yet, they are also thoroughly modern creations, shaped by contemporary values, contemporary technologies, contemporary debates about access and representation, and whose stories get told. So let us begin at the beginning, or as close to the beginning as we can reach, in the ancient world, where the roots of museum culture first took hold in soil we can still examine, still touch, still wonder about. The ancient Greeks had a word for it, mousion, a place sacred to the muses, those 9 divine sisters who governed the arts and sciences, who whispered inspiration to poets and philosophers, who presided over memory itself. In Alexandria, in the 3rd century before the Common Era, under the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt, there stood a mousion that was unlike anything the world had seen before, not a temple exactly, though it served sacred purposes, not a library alone, though it contained more scrolls than could be counted, but rather a great institution dedicated to learning, to collection, to the preservation of knowledge. Imagine it, if you can, this sprawling complex of buildings near the royal palace, its lecture halls and dining rooms, its gardens planted with specimens gathered from across the known world, its astronomical instruments gleaming bronze in the Mediterranean sun, and everywhere, the collected things. Scholars walked these halls on royal stipends, freed from the need to earn their living, able to devote themselves entirely to study, to observation, to the careful documentation of everything they could examine, botanical samples pressed and labeled, anatomical specimens preserved in ways we can only guess at, minerals and gems arranged by color and weight, manuscripts copied and recopied to preserve their contents. This was collection as a form of power. The Ptolemies understood that to gather the knowledge of the world was to possess a kind of sovereignty that transcended mere military might. They sent agents to distant ports with instructions to copy any book that arrived on a ship, sometimes keeping the originals and returning the copies, building their collection through a combination of patronage and what we might today call systematic acquisition. But the Mouseion was not a public institution, not in any sense we would recognize. It served the scholars, the elite, the court. Its treasures were not displayed for the common people to wander past on a quiet afternoon. Its knowledge was guarded, protected, accessible only to those deemed worthy of entry, and in time, as all things in time must, it faded, was damaged, was partially destroyed, until finally the great Mouseion of Alexandria existed only in historical records and in the imaginations of those who read about it and wondered. Yet the impulse it represented never disappeared. It simply transformed, migrated, found new expressions in new contexts. In ancient Rome, wealthy citizens built private collections that filled entire wings of their villas. Statues plundered from Greece lined the colonnades. Painted panels adorned the walls. Libraries held scrolls in Latin and Greek. Gardens displayed exotic plants brought from the far reaches of the empire. These were not museums in the modern sense. They were expressions of status, markers of cultural sophistication, demonstrations of wealth and taste. The collected objects existed primarily to glorify their owners, to impress visitors, to signal membership in an educated elite. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History Crucials, described these collections with a mixture of admiration and criticism. He marveled at the rare specimens and artistic treasures, but also questioned the obsessive accumulation, the competitive hoarding that drove collectors to pay fortunes for a single statue or painting. And when Rome fell, when the empire fragmented and contracted, much of what had been collected was lost, melted down for the metal, burned for fuel, buried in rubble, scattered across a landscape that had forgotten how to maintain such elaborate structures of cultural preservation. For centuries, through what historians once called the Dark Ages, the primary preservers of collected knowledge were the monasteries, those isolated communities where monks copied manuscripts by candlelight, where libraries grew slowly, one volume at a time, where certain precious objects, reliquaries, illuminated gospels, carved ivory panels were kept safe behind stone walls. These were not museums. They were treasuries, sacred repositories. The objects they contained were venerated. Their value was primarily spiritual rather than aesthetic or scholarly. A fragment of bone from a saint mattered not for its physical properties, but for its connection to the divine, its ability to work miracles, to draw pilgrims who would kneel before it in supplication. Yet even here, even in this religious context, the impulse to collect and preserve was being maintained, kept alive through centuries of upheaval and transformation, waiting for conditions that would allow it to flourish again in new forms. The turning came gradually, as most turnings do, in the city-states of Renaissance Italy, in the courts of ambitious princes, in the studios of artists who were also scholars, also scientists, also philosophers of a new kind. In Florence, in the 15th century, the Medici family began to assemble collections that went beyond mere displays of wealth. Cosimo de' Medici and later Lorenzo the Magnificent gathered not only paintings and sculptures, but also ancient manuscripts, coins and medals, carved gems, mathematical instruments, anatomical specimens, natural curiosities. Their collections served multiple purposes. They demonstrated the family's cultural leadership. They provided material for study and contemplation. They attracted scholars and artists to Florence, creating an intellectual environment that would help spark the broader cultural flowering we call the Renaissance. And crucially, these collections were sometimes accessible to scholars, to artists who wanted to study from classical models, to visitors deemed worthy of viewing such treasures. They existed in a space between private and public, between hoarded treasure and shared cultural resource. In the Medici gardens, young artists like Michelangelo studied ancient sculptures, learning anatomy from marble figures. Absorbing the principles of classical composition, the collection served as a kind of three-dimensional textbook, a teaching tool that existed in physical space rather than on a written page. Other Italian princes followed suit. In Mantua, in Ferrara, in Urbino, in Rome itself, collections grew and multiplied, each ruler trying to outdo the others, each collection reflecting the particular interests and obsessions of its patron. Isabella d'Este, the Marchioness of Mantua, created a studiolo, a small private study, where she surrounded herself with paintings, sculptures, musical instruments, books, ancient artifacts, cameos, and medals, creating an intimate space for contemplation and intellectual pursuit, a room that was both a collection and a kind of Gesamtkunstwerk, a total work of art. But these were still fundamentally private spaces, controlled access, serving the needs and desires of individual collectors. The idea that such collections might belong to the public, might serve civic or educational purposes, that was still germinating, still forming in the minds of thinkers who were beginning to imagine different relationships between rulers and ruled, between knowledge and power. The 16th century brought a new phenomenon, the Wunderkammer, the Cabinet of Curiosities, a form of collection that spread across Europe like a particularly virulent idea, taking root wherever there were people with means and curiosity and space to house gathered things. These cabinets were entire rooms, sometimes entire buildings, filled with a bewildering array of objects, natural specimens and artistic creations, scientific instruments and religious relics, the exotic and the familiar arranged side by side according to principles that seem strange to modern eyes. A Wunderkammer might contain a narwhal tusk labeled as a unicorn horn, a coconut carved into an elaborate cup, coral branches and crystalline minerals, insects pinned in rows, coins from distant lands, an ostrich egg mounted in silver, anatomical models in wax, mechanical automata, paintings of landscapes real and imagined, all of it jumbled together in a profusion that overwhelmed the senses. These collections were not organized by the taxonomies we would recognize today, not separated into art and natural history, not arranged by chronology or geography. Instead, they followed a logic of wonder, of curiosity, of the desire to assemble a microcosm, a world in miniature, where everything connected to everything else in ways both obvious and obscure. Ole Worm, a Danish physician and collector, created a cabinet so famous that visitors traveled from across Europe to see it. His collection filled a large room from floor to ceiling, antlers and tusks mounted on the walls, birds and fish suspended from the ceiling, shelves packed with shells and minerals and preserved creatures, each object labeled and catalogued in his meticulous records. And here, in these cabinets, we can see the beginning of something recognizable, the impulse not just to collect, but to organize, to document, to create systems of knowledge based on physical evidence. These collectors were amateur scholars, proto-scientists, building their understanding of the world by gathering pieces of it and studying them closely. The cabinets served multiple functions. They impressed visitors with the owner's wealth and learning. They provided material for study and contemplation. They satisfied a deep human hunger to know, to understand, to make sense of a world that was revealing itself to be far larger and stranger than anyone had previously imagined. Ships were returning from voyages of exploration and conquest, bringing with them objects that European collectors had never imagined: feathered cloaks from the Americas, carved masks from Africa, porcelain from China, specimens of plants and animals that defied existing categories, that demanded new ways of thinking about the natural world and humanity's place within it. The cabinets of curiosity swelled with these imports, each new object raising questions, suggesting connections, challenging established understanding. A collector might spend hours examining a single shell, noting its spiral pattern, its weight and texture, comparing it to other shells in the collection, trying to understand the principles that governed its form. In the 17th century, the pace of collection accelerated, and with it came new ideas about how collections might be organized, what purposes they might serve, who might have access to them. The Ashmolean Museum opened in Oxford in 1683, not as a private cabinet, but as a public institution, the first of its kind, built to house the collection of Elias Ashmole, which itself incorporated the earlier collection of the gardener and naturalist John Tradescant and his son, also John Tradescant. The Tradescants had created what they called the Ark, a collection of rarities displayed in their London home. Visitors could pay a small fee to view stuffed birds and preserved fish, ethnographic objects from Virginia, a dodo's foot, Guy Fawkes's lantern, the hand of a mermaid, or so it was labeled, objects both genuine and fraudulent, wondrous and mundane, all mixed together in that characteristic 17th century profusion. When this collection moved to Oxford, when it was installed in a purpose-built building, when it was placed under the care of the university, something fundamental shifted. The objects were no longer primarily the possessions of an individual. They belonged to an institution. They existed for study, for the advancement of knowledge, for the education of scholars, and the edification of the curious public. The building itself was designed with this purpose in mind. The ground floor served as a chemistry laboratory. The upper floor housed the collections. Visitors climbed the stairs and entered rooms where specimens were arranged in cabinets, where they could examine objects firsthand, where the material evidence of the world's diversity was made available for contemplation. This was revolutionary, not in the sense of sudden upheaval, but in the quieter sense of fundamental reorientation, the idea that collected objects might serve public good might belong not to a prince or a private enthusiast, but to an institution dedicated to learning. This idea would take root and spread, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. In London, Hans Sloane was assembling a collection of staggering scope. As a physician and naturalist, he had traveled to Jamaica, had studied plants and animals, had gathered specimens, had corresponded with collectors and scholars across Europe. His collection eventually numbered more than 71,000 objects, dried plants, minerals, coins and medals, books and manuscripts, ethnographic artifacts, natural history specimens of every description. When Sloane died in 1753, he bequeathed his collection to the nation on the condition that Parliament pay his heirs £20,000, a fraction of its true value. Parliament agreed, purchased Sloane's collection along with several important libraries, and established the British Museum, which opened to the public in 1759. The British Museum represented a new model, a national institution founded by Act of Parliament, housed in a grand London mansion, Montague House, its collections available to all studious and curious persons, though in practice access was controlled. Visitors needed to apply in writing. Tours were conducted in small groups at appointed times. The museum served the public, but on its own carefully regulated terms. The collections were arranged in a manner that reflected both the cabinets of curiosity that preceded them and newer systematic approaches. Natural history specimens filled some rooms. Manuscripts and books occupied others. Ancient sculptures and artifacts were displayed in separate galleries. The sheer volume of material defied easy categorization, but the attempt to impose order, to create meaningful arrangements, this was central to the museum's mission. Elsewhere in Europe, royal collections were beginning their transformation into public institutions. The Louvre, which had served as a royal palace, began to open parts of its collection to the public even before the French Revolution. Artists could visit on certain days to study and copy masterworks. Scholars could request access to view specific objects. Then came 1789 and the Revolution, and suddenly the entire question of who owned cultural patrimony was violently reframed. The royal collections, the treasures of the church, the possessions of fleeing aristocrats. All of this became, in revolutionary ideology, the property of the nation, the heritage of the people. The Louvre was transformed into the Muséum Central des Arts, opening to the public in 1793. Imagine it, these galleries that had been the domain of kings, now walked by citizens who had never dreamed of entering such spaces, who stood before paintings and sculptures that had been hidden behind palace walls, who were told, "These belong to you now. These are yours to see, to study, to claim as part of your national inheritance." The ideals were lofty: universal access, education for all, the democratization of culture. The reality was more complicated. The museum quickly became a repository for art looted from conquered territories. As Napoleon's armies swept across Europe, they sent back paintings and sculptures, entire collections, cartloads of cultural treasures that were displayed in the Louvre as evidence of French supremacy, of the Republic's and later the Empire's civilizing mission. This pattern would repeat itself again and again. The museum as an instrument of nationalism, of empire, of cultural assertion, institutions that claimed to represent universal human heritage while simultaneously serving very particular political purposes, advancing specific national narratives, legitimizing conquest and appropriation. The 19th century saw museums multiply across Europe and North America. Each major city needed its museum, needed its temple of culture, its storehouse of knowledge. These buildings rose in classical style, the columns and pediments, marble and bronze, architectural forms that deliberately echoed Greek and Roman temples, that positioned the museum as a sacred space, a secular cathedral dedicated to art and learning. Inside these grand buildings, new approaches to collection and display were being developed. The old jumbled arrangements of the cabinets of curiosity gave way to systematic organization. Objects were grouped by type, by period, by geography. Natural history museums separated their specimens into taxonomic categories. Art museums arranged works by school and chronology. The goal was not wonder but understanding, not amazement but education. Curators emerged as a professional class, scholars who dedicated themselves to the study and care of collections, who developed expertise in specific areas, who published catalogs and research papers, who saw the museum as a research institution as much as a public attraction. Conservation became a science. People began to understand that objects deteriorated, that light and humidity and temperature and handling all caused damage, that preservation required active intervention, specialized knowledge, controlled environments, museums built laboratories, hired chemists and restorers, developed techniques for stabilizing fragile materials, for halting or slowing the inevitable processes of decay. The great natural history museums of the 19th century were particularly ambitious in their scope. They aimed to collect and display the entire diversity of life on Earth, to create comprehensive taxonomic collections that would serve scientific research, to educate the public about the natural world through displays of mounted specimens, of skeletons, and taxidermied animals arranged in lifelike poses. The American Museum of Natural History in New York, the Natural History Museum in London, the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris. These institutions sent expeditions to every continent, collected millions of specimens, built vast research collections stored behind the scenes, accessible to scholars but never displayed to the public. The visible exhibitions were merely the surface. Beneath them lay storerooms that held the bulk of the holdings, drawers of insects, jars of preserved specimens, bones and skins and pressed plants, all carefully labeled and catalogued. Carl Akeley, the taxidermist and sculptor, pioneered a new approach to natural history display, creating habitat dioramas that showed animals in meticulously recreated natural environments. He traveled to Africa to study elephants and gorillas, took detailed measurements and photographs, collected plants and soil samples, then recreated entire scenes in museum halls, the animals mounted in lifelike poses, surrounded by painted backdrops and actual vegetation. The effect was to transport viewers into another world, to create windows onto distant ecosystems. These dioramas required enormous labor, teams of artists and technicians working for months or years on a single display. But they represented a philosophy, the idea that museums should not simply show isolated specimens, but should educate visitors about ecology, about the relationships between organisms and their environments, about the interconnectedness of natural systems. Art museums were developing their own philosophies of display. Debates raged about how paintings should be hung, whether by chronology or by school, whether walls should be crowded with works or each piece given space to breathe, whether the goal was comprehensive display or selective presentation of masterpieces. The late 19th and early 20th centuries brought new technologies that transformed what museums could be. Electric lighting freed institutions from dependence on natural light, allowed evening hours, made possible the illumination of interior spaces that had been perpetually dim. Photography created new possibilities for documentation, for cataloging, for sharing images of collections with scholars who could not visit in person. Museums became sites of spectacle, of grand exhibitions that drew enormous crowds. The plaster cast galleries were particularly popular, where reproductions of classical sculptures and architectural elements allowed visitors to experience works they could never see in their original locations. A museum in Boston or Chicago could display casts of the Parthenon sculptures, could create a kind of virtual tour of European cultural monuments, bringing the world's heritage to those who could not afford to travel. But this was also the height of colonial acquisition, European powers ruling vast territories in Africa and Asia, sending anthropologists and archaeologists to excavate and collect, shipping cultural treasures back to metropolitan museums, often with little or no consultation with local populations, with minimal documentation of context or significance. The ethnographic museums filled with objects taken from colonized peoples, masks and sculptures, textiles and ceramics, tools and weapons, religious objects that had been removed from their sacred contexts, displayed behind glass for European audiences who viewed them through lenses of racial hierarchy and evolutionary theory. The museum served to reinforce colonial narratives, to position non-European cultures as primitive, as frozen in time, as subjects for Western study, rather than as dynamic societies with their own histories and values. The early 20th century also saw the rise of industrial magnates who became museum patrons on an unprecedented scale. Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, Henry Clay Frick, J.P. Morgan, these men accumulated vast fortunes and used portions of them to build or support museums, sometimes driven by genuine passion for art or science, sometimes by desire for social prestige, often by both. Their philanthropy shaped the museum landscape, created institutions that bore their names, that reflected their tastes and interests. The Museum of Modern Art in New York, founded in 1929, represented a new kind of institution dedicated not to the art of the past, but to contemporary creation, to living artists working in new styles and media. This required different curatorial approaches, different ways of thinking about what belonged in a museum. How to evaluate work that had not yet stood the test of time. How to balance aesthetic judgment with historical documentation. MoMA's founding director, Alfred H. Barr, Jr., developed an approach that treated modern art as a legitimate field of study, that sought to establish canonical narratives, that used the museum's authority to validate certain artistic movements while marginalizing others. The museum became not just a repository, but an active participant in shaping artistic discourse, in determining what counted as important, as worthy of preservation and display. The Second World War brought new challenges and transformations. Museums across Europe evacuated their collections, packed masterpieces into crates, sent them to country estates, to salt mines, to any place that might protect them from bombing. The Louvre dispersed its holdings across France. The British Museum moved objects out of London. In Germany, museum directors made anguished decisions about what to save, what to leave behind. When the war ended, questions of ownership and restitution became urgent. Artworks looted by the Nazis, cultural objects displaced by the chaos of war. Who owned what? Who had the right to reclaim pieces of cultural heritage? These questions would persist for decades, remain unresolved even now, as museums grapple with the provenance of their collections, with the ethics of possession. The post-war period also brought democratizing impulses, a belief that museums should be truly accessible, not just legally open, but actively welcoming to all segments of society. This meant rethinking everything from admission fees to exhibition design, from the language used in labels to the representation of different cultures and perspectives. New types of museums emerged, science centers with hands-on exhibits, children's museums designed specifically for young visitors, living history museums where interpreters in period dress recreated past lifeways, eco-museums that treated entire landscapes as collections, that worked with local communities to preserve and interpret regional heritage. The Pompidou Center in Paris, opening in 1977, challenged conventional museum architecture with its inside-out design, its exposed structural elements, its escalators climbing the exterior in transparent tubes. This was a museum that announced itself as contemporary, as experimental, as fundamentally different from the classical temples that had dominated museum design for 2 centuries. Technology continued to reshape museum practice. Climate control systems became more sophisticated, allowing precise regulation of temperature and humidity. Conservation techniques advanced, enabling the preservation of increasingly fragile materials. Computer databases transformed collection management, making it possible to track and access information about millions of objects. But the late 20th century also brought crisis and critique. Indigenous peoples and descendant communities began demanding the return of cultural objects and human remains, questioning the right of museums to hold materials taken without consent, sacred objects displayed as ethnographic specimens, ancestors' bones studied as archaeological data. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, passed in 1990, required U.S. museums to inventory their collections of human remains and sacred objects, to consult with tribes, to repatriate materials when claims were made. This represented a fundamental shift in the power dynamics that had governed museum collecting, an acknowledgement that museums did not have absolute rights over everything in their possession. Similar movements arose around the world, in Australia, in New Zealand, in Canada, in Africa. Communities demanded not just the return of objects, but also participation in decisions about what was collected, how it was displayed, what stories were told. Museums began, slowly, reluctantly at first, to share authority, to collaborate with source communities, to recognize multiple perspectives and competing narratives. The question of colonial acquisition became impossible to ignore. The Benin bronzes in European museums, the Parthenon marbles in the British Museum, the bust of Nefertiti in Berlin, countless other objects whose presence in Western institutions was predicated on conquest, on unequal power relations, on a belief that European museums were the proper guardians of world heritage. These objects became flashpoints for debates about restitution, about cultural ownership, about the post-colonial responsibilities of institutions built on colonial foundations. Museums responded in various ways. Some resisted calls for repatriation, citing legal ownership, concern for conservation, belief in universal museums as repositories for all humanity. Others began programs of return, of collaboration, of shared stewardship that allowed objects to circulate between institutions, to be cared for jointly by museums and communities of origin. The digital age brought new possibilities and new challenges. Museums began digitizing their collections, creating online databases that made holdings accessible to anyone with internet access. Virtual tours allowed people to explore galleries from anywhere in the world. Three-dimensional scans could capture objects in detail that exceeded what was visible to the naked eye. But digitization also raised questions. Who owned these digital assets? Who controlled access? How did virtual experience relate to physical encounter? Could seeing a high-resolution image of a painting ever substitute for standing before the actual work, feeling its scale, seeing the texture of brush strokes, experiencing it in the specific context of a gallery space? The 21st Century Museum is a complex institution, simultaneously guardian of the past and agent of contemporary relevance, educational resource and tourist destination, research center and community hub, keeper of collections and facilitator of experiences. These multiple roles create tensions, competing demands, ongoing negotiations about purpose and priority. The blockbuster exhibition became a staple of museum programming, major shows of popular artists or themes, designed to draw large crowds, to generate revenue, to raise the museum's profile. These exhibitions required years of planning, complex negotiations for loans, extensive marketing campaigns. They could introduce new audiences to museums, but they also risked turning institutions into entertainment venues, prioritizing spectacle over scholarship, crowds over contemplation. At the same time, many museums were working to become more responsive to their local communities, developing programs for underserved populations, creating exhibitions that addressed contemporary social issues, hiring more diverse staff, examining their own histories and practices with critical eyes, asking difficult questions about whose voices had been centered, whose stories had been ignored or marginalized. The museum as a neutral space, a temple of timeless values. This idea was being challenged, replaced by recognition that museums are always political, always shaped by the contexts in which they operate, always making choices about what to collect, what to display, how to interpret, what narratives to privilege. These choices have consequences. They shape how visitors understand the world, how they see themselves and others, how they imagine past, present, and future. And now, as we move deeper into this century, as museums continue to evolve, as they grapple with questions of access and equity, of repatriation and representation, of sustainability and relevance, we find ourselves at a moment of both continuity and transformation. These institutions still perform many of the same functions they have for centuries. They collect, preserve, study, display, but the frameworks within which they operate are shifting. The assumptions that once seemed solid are being questioned. The future of museums is being actively imagined and debated and created. Perhaps the most profound thing about museums, the thing that makes them both strange and necessary, is that they exist in a kind of temporal suspension, objects removed from the flow of ordinary time, held in a state of preservation that resists decay, resists change, resists the natural processes that would otherwise return them to dust. A painting created 400 years ago hangs on a gallery wall, its colors still vivid, protected from light and moisture, monitored and conserved. It exists now in a way it never existed for its original viewers, who saw it in natural light, in a domestic setting, who watched it darken and crack over years of exposure. The museum version is both more and less than the original, more perfectly preserved, less embedded in lived experience. This suspension creates a particular relationship with the past. Museums offer us encounter with things that have survived, that have been chosen for survival, but this choosing is never neutral, never complete, for every object preserved. Countless others have been lost, forgotten, deemed unworthy of the effort required to maintain them through time. The museum collection is always a fragment, a tiny selection from the infinite array of things that humans have made and used. It represents not the past itself, but rather our present-day ideas about what matters in the past, what deserves to be remembered, what stories we want to tell about where we came from and how we got to here. And these ideas change, shift with each generation. Objects once considered important fall out of favor. Things once ignored are rediscovered, revalued, brought out of storage and placed on display. The museum is a living thing in this sense, constantly rearranging itself, reconsidering its holdings, responding to new scholarship, new social movements, new ways of understanding the world. Consider the shift in how ethnographic collections are viewed. Objects once displayed as curiosities, as evidence of primitive cultures, are now understood as sophisticated artistic and technological achievements, as expressions of complex cosmologies and social systems. The objects themselves have not changed, but our capacity to see them, to understand them, to respect them has evolved, or begun to evolve. The work is ongoing, incomplete. The museum also creates a particular kind of looking, a mode of attention that is both focused and abstracted. We stand before objects removed from their original context, from their functional purposes, from the hands that made and used them. We look at them aesthetically, analytically. We read labels that provide information, interpretation, context that the objects themselves cannot convey. This can be deeply illuminating. It can also be distorting. A mask created for sacred ceremony becomes an art object, appreciated for its formal qualities, its craftsmanship, but divorced from the spiritual power it once held, the religious functions it performed. The museum transforms it, even as it preserves it, changes its meaning, even as it maintains its physical form. Some theorists argue that this transformation is inevitable, that once an object enters a museum, it becomes something different, a museum object, subject to new regimes of value, new systems of meaning. Others insist that objects retain their original significance, that museums have a responsibility to honor and maintain these connections, to work with communities to ensure that sacred or culturally significant items are treated appropriately, not merely preserved but respected. These tensions are productive. They generate conversations, spark reforms, push museums to reconsider their practices, but they are also uncomfortable. They reveal the extent to which museums are implicated in histories of colonialism, of appropriation, of unequal power relations. Facing these histories honestly requires courage, requires a willingness to change, to relinquish control, to share authority in ways that fundamentally alter how institutions operate. And yet, despite all these complications, despite the valid critiques and necessary reforms, there remains something powerful about the museum experience, something that draws millions of people through their doors each year, that creates moments of wonder, of connection, of recognition. To stand in a gallery surrounded by paintings from another century, to see how artists wrestled with light and color, how they tried to capture fleeting moments, to express inner visions, this offers a kind of communion across time, a reminder that humans have always been driven to create, to make meaning through material form, to examine a fossil millions of years old, to contemplate the vast stretches of geological time, the processes of evolution and extinction that have shaped life on Earth. This can induce a kind of productive vertigo, a recognition of our own smallness, our brief tenure on this planet, and simultaneously our connection to everything that came before, to see objects from distant cultures, to learn about different ways of organizing society, different belief systems and value structures, different solutions to universal human challenges. This can expand our sense of possibility, challenge our assumptions about what is natural or inevitable, remind us that the world we inhabit is just one of many possible worlds. Museums at their best create spaces for this kind of encounter, for slowing down, for looking closely, for thinking deeply, in a world that increasingly demands constant distraction, perpetual connectivity, rapid consumption of images and information. The museum offers something different, permission to linger, to contemplate, to let mind and eye wander. The future of museums remains uncertain, as it always has been. Institutions that have survived for centuries have done so by adapting, by finding new relevance for each generation, by balancing preservation with innovation, tradition with transformation. Some museums will fail this test, will become mausoleums rather than living institutions, will retreat into irrelevance. Others will find new ways to serve their communities, new partnerships and collaborations, new technologies and methodologies. They will continue to evolve, to surprise, to challenge our expectations of what a museum can be. And through all these changes, the fundamental act of preservation continues. In climate-controlled storage rooms, in conservation laboratories, in digital archives, museum workers labor to protect the material evidence of human and natural history, to maintain these collections for future generations, whose interests and questions we cannot predict, whose needs we cannot anticipate. This is an act of faith, a belief that these objects will matter, that future people will want to encounter them, to study them, to draw meaning from them. It is also an acknowledgement of responsibility, a recognition that we are merely temporary stewards, caretakers of materials that belong, in some sense, to everyone and no one, to the past and the future simultaneously. Tonight, as I think about museums in the quiet hours, I imagine all those objects resting in darkness behind locked doors, waiting for morning when visitors will return, when gallery lights will illuminate them once more. They wait patiently, these fragments of the past, these carefully preserved remnants. They have already waited so long, through centuries and millennia, through periods of neglect and periods of intense attention. They can wait a little longer. And I think about the people who will walk through those galleries tomorrow, who will pause before a particular painting or specimen, who will feel something stir in them, curiosity or recognition or wonder, who will carry that feeling out into the world, changed in some small way by the encounter, reminded of something they had forgotten, introduced to something they never knew existed. The museum persists, adapts, transforms, but at its heart remains this simple thing, this gathering of objects, this attempt to hold fragments of the world in one place, to create meaning through collection and arrangement, to preserve what would otherwise be lost, to remember, to study, to share. The lights dim in the empty galleries. The last footsteps fade away. The building settles into its nighttime rhythms. The gentle hum of ventilation systems, the occasional creak of old wood, the presence of all those collected things, silent, patient, enduring. Outside, the city continues its restless motion, but here, in this purposeful stillness, time moves differently, measured not in hours, but in centuries, in the slow accumulation of knowledge, the gradual transformation of understanding, the patient work of preservation that connects past to present to future, and somewhere in a storage room accessible only to staff, or a conservation laboratory where specialists work with microscopes and delicate tools, or a curator's office where research continues into the night. The work goes on, cataloging and documenting, analyzing and interpreting, caring for collections, adding slowly to the sum of human knowledge. The museum sleeps but does not rest. It waits, it preserves, it holds within itself the multiplicity of stories, the diversity of human experience and natural phenomena, the complexity of history that can never be fully captured, never completely understood, but must nevertheless be gathered, protected, studied, shared. In the morning, doors will open once more, visitors will enter, and the cycle will continue, has continued for centuries, will continue for centuries more. If we choose to maintain these institutions, if we commit the resources and care required, if we believe that preservation matters, that encounter with the past and with the diversity of the world enriches the present, the last thought fades like a voice trailing off into distance. The museum remains solid and present, a repository of memory, a space of possibility, a bridge across time, gathering the world's fragments, holding them gently, offering them to whoever comes seeking whatever they hope to find. There is a kind of evening when the mind begins to wander toward the structures that hold the world together, not the beams and bolts themselves, but the invisible architecture of thought, the long unfolding story of how human beings learn to shape the forces of nature, to redirect rivers, to span chasms, to turn the hidden laws of physics into bridges and engines and cities that rise against the sky. Tonight, the air feels still, as if the world itself has paused, and in that pause there is space to consider something vast and quiet, something that stretches back through centuries, through millennia. The field of engineering, a word that carries within it the echo of ingenuity, of problems solved in darkness, of minds that looked at stone and water and wind and saw not obstacles but possibilities. The word itself comes from the Latin ingenium, meaning cleverness, innate quality, a kind of natural talent for invention. And from that root grew the idea of the engineer, the one who devises, who constructs, who transforms the raw materials of the earth into tools and shelter and pathways forward. But the practice, the actual doing of engineering, predates the word by thousands of years, stretching back to the first human who looked at a heavy stone and imagined a lever, who saw a log and envisioned a wheel. In the beginning, there were no categories, no disciplines with formal names. There was only necessity, the need for water where there was none, the need for warmth when winter came, the need to cross a river without being swept away. And so the first engineers emerged, not from universities or guilds, but from the simple human drive to solve problems, to make life a little less precarious, a little more predictable. Imagine the Nile, thousands of years ago, the annual flooding that brought both fertility and chaos. And imagine the minds that studied those patterns, that learned to predict the rising waters, that devised systems of channels and basins to capture and distribute what the river offered. They had no textbooks, no equations written in modern notation, but they understood through observation and trial, through failure and adjustment, the principles that govern flow and pressure, storage and distribution. Or picture the great pyramids rising from the desert sand, monuments that still confound us with their precision, their massive scale, built without cranes or computers, without steel or engines, only human ingenuity, simple machines, the inclined plane, the lever, the wheel, and an understanding, intuitive but profound, of geometry, of force, of how to move stones weighing tons across miles of sand and lift them into perfect alignment with the stars. These were not random achievements, not accidents of history. They were the products of systematic thinking, of observation translated into method, of knowledge passed from one generation to the next, refined, expanded, tested against the unforgiving reality of stone and water and gravity. Engineering, in its essence, is the application of knowledge to the transformation of the physical world. It is the bridge between understanding and doing, between theory and practice. It takes the abstract laws discovered by science, the mathematics that describes how things move and change, and it asks a different question. Not what is true, but what is possible. Not how does this work, but how can we make this work for us? And so, over thousands of years, across every civilization that left its mark on history, there were engineers, though they might have been called builders, architects, master craftsmen, inventors. They were the ones who looked at a problem, a need, a dream, and found a way to make it real, to turn imagination into stone and bronze and iron, into structures that endured, into systems that sustained life. The Romans, with their aqueducts marching across the countryside, carrying clean water into the heart of cities, understanding the gentle gradient needed to maintain flow over miles, the arch that could support tremendous weight while using less material than a simple beam, the Chinese with their great wall snaking across mountains and valleys, but also with their innovations less visible to the casual eye, the deep drilling techniques that reached underground brine, the iron suspension bridges that predated their Western counterparts by centuries, the complex systems of canals that linked rivers and enabled trade across vast distances, the Islamic Golden Age, when scholars in Baghdad and Cairo and Cordoba preserved and expanded the knowledge of the ancient world, developing advanced mechanical devices, water clocks of astonishing complexity, automated machines that seemed almost magical, but were built on careful observation of gears and levers, of pneumatics and hydraulics. Each civilization, each era, adding to the accumulated knowledge, solving problems unique to their geography and climate, their available materials, their social needs, and in doing so, discovering principles that transcended any single application, insights that could be carried forward, adapted, refined, built upon by those who came after. Tonight, as we begin to trace this long story, we stand at a vantage point where we can look back across the full span, from the first stone tools to the satellites orbiting overhead, and see not a chaotic jumble of disconnected inventions, but a continuous thread, a conversation across time, each generation of engineers learning from the last, asking new questions, finding new answers, pushing against the boundaries of what seemed possible. The earliest engineers, if we can call them that, worked with what the earth provided, stone and clay and wood, and they worked without the abstraction of mathematics as we know it, without formulas written on paper. But they possessed something equally powerful, an intuitive grasp of proportion, of balance, of cause and effect, observed through patient attention to the world around them in ancient Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where the land was flat and fertile but vulnerable to flooding. The first cities began to rise, and with them came problems that demanded solutions on a scale never before attempted. How to irrigate fields far from the riverbank? How to store grain against seasons of scarcity? How to build structures that would not dissolve in the rain? Because the stone that other civilizations relied upon was scarce here, and so they turned to what they had in abundance, mud and reeds and the fierce heat of the sun. They discovered that clay, when shaped and dried, became brick, and that brick, when fired in kilns, became something harder, more durable, capable of bearing weight and resisting water. And with these bricks they built the ziggurats, stepped pyramids that rose above the floodplain, temples and administrative centers that announced the presence of human order imposed upon the chaos of nature. But the engineering of Mesopotamia was not only about monuments, it was fundamentally about water, about controlling the rivers that gave life, but also brought destruction. They dug canals, elaborate networks that stretched for miles, carrying water to fields that would otherwise lie barren. They built levees to contain floods, reservoirs to store surplus, and in doing so they learned the principles of hydraulics through direct experience, understanding how water seeks its level, how the width and depth of a channel affects the speed of flow, how sediment accumulates and must be cleared. These were not merely practical achievements. They represented a shift in human consciousness, the realization that nature, while powerful, could be negotiated with, redirected, that human beings were not helpless before the forces of river and rain, but could become active participants in shaping their environment in Egypt, Along the Nile, a different relationship with water emerged. Here the flooding was more predictable, almost rhythmic, arriving each year with the precision of a calendar, and the Egyptians built their civilization around this rhythm, developing tools and techniques to maximize what the flood offered. They surveyed the land with remarkable accuracy, understanding that precise measurement was essential when floodwaters erased boundary markers each year. The rope stretchers, the harpedonaptai, would lay out right angles using knotted cords. A rope with 12 equal segments could form a triangle with sides of 3, 4, and 5 units, and that triangle would contain a perfect right angle, a truth encoded in the relationship between numbers, a truth that could be used to ensure walls stood vertical, that corners met squarely, that the massive blocks of stone would align with mathematical precision. The pyramids at Giza, built during the 4th dynasty around 4,500 years ago, remain among the most astonishing engineering achievements in human history, not because later ages could not build larger structures, but because of what they represent: the marshaling of resources, the organization of labor, the solution of problems for which there were no precedents. Consider the logistics alone. The Great Pyramid contains approximately 2,300,000 blocks, each weighing on average 2.5 tons, quarried, transported, lifted into position, fitted so precisely that a blade cannot slip between them. And all of this accomplished without iron tools, without wheels for heavy transport, without pulleys as we understand them today. How did they move these stones, these masses of limestone and granite, across miles of desert and up the rising flanks of the pyramid itself? Scholars still debate the exact methods, but the principles are clear. They used sledges, wooden platforms on which stones were dragged, and they understood that wet sand counterintuitively provides less resistance than dry, that pouring water before the sledge reduces friction, allows fewer workers to move greater weight. They used ramps, though whether these were straight ramps running up one face, or spiral ramps winding around the structure, or internal ramps threading through the pyramid itself, remains uncertain. But ramps they must have used, exploiting the principle of the inclined plane, trading distance for mechanical advantage, making the impossible merely difficult, the difficult merely laborious. And they used levers, simple bars of wood, that could pivot against a fulcrum, multiplying force, allowing workers to lift and position stones with precision, adjusting, correcting, ensuring that each block settled exactly where it needed to be, not approximately, but exactly, because the whole structure depended on this precision, on the distribution of weight, on the integrity of angles and alignments. But perhaps most remarkably, they planned, they calculated, they understood that a project of this scale required not just physical labor but intellectual organization. Someone had to determine how many workers were needed, how much food they would consume, how many tools would wear out and need replacement, how to coordinate the quarries and the transport teams and the builders so that work flowed continuously, so that blocks arrived as they were needed, neither too quickly to overcrowd the site nor too slowly to leave workers idle. This was engineering not just of stone, but of systems, of human organization, of logistics and supply chains, concepts that would remain central to the field for millennia to come. Across the Mediterranean, on the island of Crete, the Minoan civilization developed its own engineering marvels, particularly in the realm of water management. The palace at Knossos, built around 3,800 years ago, featured sophisticated plumbing, terracotta pipes that brought fresh water into the building, separate pipes that carried waste water away, even flush toilets, luxuries that would not be seen again in Europe for thousands of years. They understood hydraulic principles, how to maintain pressure in pipes, how to use settling basins to clarify water, how to prevent contamination of drinking supplies. And they built these systems not as isolated experiments, but as integral parts of urban infrastructure, expecting them to function reliably year after year, serving the daily needs of palace inhabitants. In the valleys of the Indus River, in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro flourished around 4,500 years ago, and these cities reveal urban planning of extraordinary sophistication. Streets laid out in precise grids, buildings constructed to standardized dimensions, public wells positioned at regular intervals, and most remarkably, comprehensive drainage systems, covered sewers running beneath the streets, collecting wastewater from individual homes, carrying it away from the inhabited areas. Every house in Mohenjo-Daro had access to water and sanitation, a level of public health infrastructure that would not be matched in many parts of the world until the 19th century. This was engineering in service of entire communities, not just palaces or temples, but the common good. The recognition that civilization depends on clean water, on the removal of waste, on systems that function invisibly, reliably, protecting health even when their workings go unnoticed. In China, during the Shang and Zhou dynasties, roughly 3,000 to 2,000 years ago, engineers developed advanced metallurgy, learning to cast bronze in complex molds, creating vessels and weapons and tools of remarkable quality. They understood that bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, could be made harder or softer by varying the proportions, that different applications required different properties, and they adjusted their techniques accordingly. They also began to work with iron earlier than their counterparts in the West, developing blast furnaces that could reach temperatures high enough to melt iron completely, allowing it to be cast into molds rather than laboriously forged. This was a technological leap, enabling the production of iron tools and implements on a scale that would have been impossible with forge methods alone. And they built canals, massive projects linking river systems, facilitating trade and transport. Some of these early canals would eventually be incorporated into the Grand Canal, a waterway stretching over 1,000 miles, connecting the Yellow River and the Yangtze, a project that would span centuries, involving millions of workers, reshaping the geography of China to serve the needs of empire and commerce. The ancient Greeks, while often celebrated for their philosophy and mathematics, were also accomplished engineers. Though their approach differed in subtle ways from the civilizations that preceded them, they were more inclined toward theory, toward understanding the why behind the how, and this theoretical bent would eventually prove immensely valuable, providing a foundation for future generations to build upon. Archimedes, working in Syracuse in the 3rd century before the Common Era, studied the principles of buoyancy and leverage, discovering laws that could be expressed mathematically. He supposedly declared, "Give me a place to stand, and I shall move the earth," referring to the lever, to the theoretical possibility that with a long enough lever and a secure fulcrum, even an enormous weight could be shifted. This was engineering thinking at a new level of abstraction, not just solving specific problems, but articulating general principles that could be applied to any number of situations. The Greeks also built theaters with acoustics so refined that a whisper at the center of the stage could be heard in the back rows. They constructed temples with columns that appeared straight but were actually slightly curved, compensating for optical illusions, ensuring that the human eye perceived perfect proportion. This was engineering married to aesthetics, the recognition that structures serve not only practical functions, but psychological and cultural ones, that beauty and utility need not be separate concerns. But it was the Romans, rising to power in the centuries that followed, who would take Greek theoretical knowledge and Etruscan practical skill and forge them into an engineering tradition of unprecedented scope and ambition. The Romans were builders of empire, and empire required infrastructure, roads to move armies and goods, aqueducts to supply cities with water, bridges to cross rivers, harbors to facilitate trade, and they approached these challenges with characteristic efficiency and scale. Roman roads, the viae, were not merely paths beaten down by foot traffic. They were engineered structures, built in layers, designed to endure. First came the excavation, digging down through soil to reach stable ground. Then a foundation of large stones, the statumen, placed to distribute weight and provide drainage. Above that, smaller stones and gravel, the rudus, compacted to create a firm base, then a layer of sand or fine gravel, the nucleus, and finally the surface, paving stones fitted so carefully that the joints between them were nearly invisible. These roads were cambered, slightly higher in the center than at the edges, so that rainwater would run off rather than pooling and seeping into the layers below. And alongside each road ran ditches, collecting this runoff, carrying it away, preventing erosion, preventing the undermining of the foundation. Every detail considered, every potential failure mode anticipated and addressed. The Via Appia, the Appian Way, built beginning in 312 before the Common Era, stretched from Rome to Brundisium, a distance of more than 350 miles, and substantial portions of it, more than 2,000 years later, can still be walked, still bear traffic, a testament to the thoroughness of Roman engineering, to the understanding that a thing built well, built with attention to drainage and foundation and material selection, could outlast empires. But perhaps the most visible legacy of Roman engineering, the structures that still dominate landscapes across what was once the empire, are the aqueducts, these great stone channels that carried water from distant springs and rivers into the hearts of cities, across valleys and over rivers, maintaining the gentle downward slope necessary to keep water flowing by gravity alone. Rome itself, at the height of the empire, was served by 11 major aqueducts, bringing in nearly 300 million gallons of water per day, supplying public baths and fountains, private homes and public latrines, creating a standard of urban life that would not be seen again in Europe until the modern era. And each of these aqueducts was a masterpiece of surveying and construction, some running for dozens of miles, tunneling through mountains, bridging valleys on arcades that still stand. The Pont du Gard in southern France carries water across the Gardon River Valley. It rises nearly 160 feet above the river, built of precisely cut stone blocks, some weighing several tons, fitted together without mortar, relying on the strength of the arch, that elegant curve that transforms the downward force of weight into outward thrust against supporting piers, distributing load, enabling structures of unprecedented span and height. The Romans did not invent the arch. Earlier civilizations had used it, but the Romans perfected it, standardized it, deployed it on a scale that transformed what was possible. They understood intuitively what later engineers would prove mathematically, that an arch, properly constructed with a keystone locking the voussoir in place, becomes stronger under load, the weight pressing down, forcing the stones more tightly together, creating a structure that supports itself through the geometry of its form. And from the arch they developed the vault, extending that curved form along an axis, creating tunnel-like spaces that could span great distances, and the dome, rotating the arch around a central point, enclosing space beneath a curved ceiling that seemed to float, defying the earthbound expectations of stone. The Pantheon in Rome, with its great concrete dome, remains the largest unreinforced concrete dome ever built, even now, nearly 2,000 years after its construction. That dome, 142 feet in diameter, with an oculus at its center open to the sky, represents not just architectural ambition but material innovation. The Romans developed concrete, a mixture of lime mortar, volcanic ash, aggregate, and water that could be poured into forms, molded into shapes impossible with cut stone, and that hardened into a material of tremendous strength. They varied the aggregate based on where in a structure the concrete would be used, heavy stone for foundations, lighter materials like pumice for upper sections, reducing weight where it mattered most. They understood empirically what modern engineers confirm with calculation, that the properties of concrete could be tuned, adjusted for specific applications, that engineering is as much about choosing the right material as designing the right form. Roman military engineering, too, reached extraordinary levels of sophistication. Armies on campaign built fortified camps each night, complete layouts with regular streets and defensive walls, constructed in a matter of hours by soldiers trained in engineering as well as combat. And when besieging cities, they built siege towers, battering rams, sophisticated machines that concentrated force at specific points. Exploiting the principles of leverage and momentum, they bridged rivers with temporary structures of remarkable ingenuity. Caesar's bridge across the Rhine, built in just 10 days, consisted of wooden piles driven into the riverbed at angles, braced against each other, supporting a roadway across which an entire army could march. And when the campaign was over, the bridge was dismantled, leaving no route for enemies to follow. Engineering as a tool of military strategy, as important as weapons or tactics. But as Rome's power eventually waned, as the empire fragmented and fell, much of this engineering knowledge became fragmented too, preserved in some places, lost in others. The early medieval period in Europe saw a decline in large-scale engineering projects, not because the capability disappeared entirely, but because the political organization and economic surplus necessary to undertake such projects had diminished. Roads fell into disrepair. Aqueducts crumbled, the infrastructure of empire slowly returning to earth, Yet engineering did not disappear. It adapted. It continued in different forms, suited to different needs. Monastic communities preserved and copied ancient texts, including works on architecture and engineering, and they applied this knowledge in practical ways, building mills to grind grain, to full cloth, to saw timber. They understood water power, how to divert streams, how to construct mill races that maintained flow, how to design water wheels that captured energy from moving water and transformed it into rotational motion. The medieval cathedral, too, represents a continuation and evolution of engineering ambition. These structures, built over decades or even centuries, pushed the limits of what could be achieved with stone. Gothic architects and master masons, for they were engineers in all but name, developed the pointed arch, which directed weight more vertically than the rounded Roman arch, allowing walls to be thinner, lighter, and between these structural elements they placed enormous windows, filling the interior with colored light, creating spaces that seemed to transcend the material from which they were built. They used flying buttresses, external supports that carried the outward thrust of the vaulted ceiling away from the walls, down into massive piers anchored in the earth. These buttresses were not hidden. They were celebrated, made visible, part of the aesthetic as well as the structural logic. Here was engineering as sculpture, as statement, as prayer made manifest in stone and glass. And slowly, beginning around the 12th century, engineering knowledge began to accumulate again, to be written down, shared more widely. The medieval period saw the development of universities, places where knowledge could be systematized, taught, expanded upon. Mathematics advanced, particularly in the Islamic world, where scholars developed algebra and preserved Greek geometry. This mathematical knowledge would gradually flow into Europe through translations, through contact during the Crusades, and through trade, enriching the intellectual foundation upon which future engineering would build. In China, meanwhile, engineering continued along its own trajectory. The Song dynasty, ruling from the 10th to the 13th century, saw remarkable innovations. They developed sophisticated clockwork mechanisms, water-driven astronomical clocks of great complexity. They refined the production of steel, creating higher quality metal through careful control of carbon content. They built ships with multiple masts and watertight compartments, vessels capable of ocean voyages, carrying trade goods and ideas across vast distances. The pound lock, a chamber with gates at each end that allows boats to be raised or lowered between different water levels, was perfected in China during this period. This innovation would eventually reach Europe, where it would enable the construction of canal networks that bypassed natural waterways, creating new routes for commerce, new possibilities for the movement of goods and materials, each lock a small engineering marvel, controlling water, managing transitions between levels, allowing boats to climb hills or descend valleys through a series of incremental steps. In the Islamic world, which stretched from Spain through North Africa and the Middle East to Central Asia, engineers developed sophisticated irrigation systems, particularly in arid regions where water management meant the difference between fertility and desert. They built qanats, underground channels that tapped into aquifers and carried water for miles, protecting it from evaporation, maintaining flow through carefully calculated gradients. These systems, some of them built more than 1,000 years ago, continue to function today, still bringing water to villages and fields. Islamic engineers also made advances in mechanical devices. They built elaborate automata, mechanical figures that moved and performed tasks. These were not merely curiosities. They demonstrated principles of gears and linkages, of converting one type of motion into another, of using water or weights as motive power. The knowledge encoded in these devices, described in treatises by engineers like Al-Jazari, would influence European clockmakers and inventors centuries later. The astrolabe, too, represents a fusion of mathematics and engineering, this intricate instrument used for navigation and astronomy, for calculating prayer times and determining latitude, required precision manufacturing, the ability to inscribe complex scales, to craft moving parts that aligned accurately. It was engineering in miniature, applying theoretical knowledge to create tools that extended human capability, that made the invisible patterns of the heavens readable, useful. By the 15th century, Europe was on the cusp of transformation. The Renaissance was beginning to flower in Italy, bringing with it a renewed interest in classical knowledge, in observation, in the systematic study of nature, and this intellectual ferment would create conditions in which engineering could advance in new ways, could become more theoretical, more mathematical, more conscious of itself as a discipline with principles that could be articulated and taught. Leonardo da Vinci, working in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, embodied this new synthesis. He was artist and engineer, theorist and practitioner. His notebooks, filled with sketches and observations, reveal a mind endlessly curious about how things work. He designed machines for flying, for moving water, for warfare, for manufacturing. Many were never built, but they demonstrate engineering imagination, the ability to conceive of mechanisms and structures, to think through the problems they would solve, the forces they would need to manage. He studied anatomy, dissecting bodies to understand the mechanics of muscles and joints. He observed birds in flight, sketching the positions of their wings, trying to understand lift and control. He was among the first to recognize that engineering was not just about building things, but about understanding the principles that made building possible, that there was a theoretical foundation beneath practical achievement, and that this foundation could be explored, expanded, made explicit. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century, represents another kind of engineering achievement, not massive in scale like aqueducts or cathedrals, but profound in its implications. Gutenberg combined several existing technologies: movable metal type, oil-based ink, a screw press adapted from winemaking, and created a system for reproducing texts with unprecedented speed and accuracy. This was engineering as system integration, taking elements from different domains, understanding how they could work together, solving the problems of alignment and pressure, of ink consistency and paper quality, creating not just a machine but a process, a workflow that could be replicated, taught, improved upon, and the result, the democratization of knowledge, books that were no longer rare treasures, but objects that could spread widely, carrying ideas, technical knowledge across distances and generations. The 16th and 17th centuries saw engineering begin to formalize as a profession. Military engineers were among the first to receive systematic training. Fortress design had become increasingly sophisticated, responding to the development of artillery, which could shatter medieval walls with relative ease. The new fortifications were lower, thicker, built in star patterns with projecting bastions that allowed defenders to fire along the walls, eliminating blind spots where attackers could shelter. Designing these fortifications required mathematics, geometry to calculate angles of fire, arithmetic to determine how thick walls needed to be to resist cannonballs of a given weight, and this mathematical approach began to spread into other areas of engineering. Galileo Galilei, in the early 17th century, studied the strength of materials, conducting experiments to understand why beams break, how their strength relates to their dimensions. This was engineering science, the attempt to put practical knowledge on a firm theoretical foundation. The 18th century, the age of enlightenment, brought further systematization. In France, the Corps des Ponts et Chaussées, the Corps of Bridges and Roads, was established, and with it came formal engineering education. The École des Ponts et Chaussées, founded in 1747, was among the first true engineering schools, where students learned not just through apprenticeship, but through systematic instruction in mathematics and mechanics, in surveying and hydraulics, in the theoretical principles underlying practice. This was revolutionary, the idea that engineering could be taught in classrooms, that there were general principles applicable across different projects, different circumstances, that an educated engineer could approach novel problems with confidence, drawing on a foundation of knowledge rather than merely copying what had been done before. And from this emerged the modern concept of civil engineering, the engineering of civilian works, roads and bridges and canals, as distinct from military engineering. The Industrial Revolution, beginning in Britain in the late 18th century, transformed engineering yet again. New power sources, first water, then steam, enabled manufacturing on unprecedented scales, and this demanded new kinds of engineering, mechanical engineers to design engines and machines, to understand thermodynamics and fluid mechanics, to convert heat into motion with ever greater efficiency. James Watt's improvements to the steam engine, made between 1765 and 1784, exemplify this new approach. He didn't invent the steam engine. Earlier versions had existed for decades, but he made it far more efficient, adding a separate condenser that kept the cylinder hot, reducing wasted energy, adding a governor that automatically regulated speed, creating a machine that could drive factory equipment, power locomotives, transform entire industries. Iron, produced in larger quantities and higher quality than ever before, became the material of choice for bridges and buildings. The iron bridge spanning the River Severn in England, completed in 1779, demonstrated what was possible: an arch of cast iron, graceful and strong, opening a new era in structural engineering. Soon iron beams and columns would replace timber, allowing buildings to rise higher, span wider, resist fire. The 19th century saw engineering diversify into increasingly specialized fields. Chemical engineering emerged as industries learned to manufacture acids and alkalis, dyes and pharmaceuticals on industrial scales. This required understanding not just chemistry, but also heat transfer and fluid flow, reaction kinetics and process control, how to scale up reactions from laboratory flasks to vessels handling thousands of gallons. electrical engineering developed as scientists came to understand electricity and magnetism. Michael Faraday's discovery of electromagnetic induction in 1831 showed that motion and magnetism could generate electrical current. This principle would enable generators and motors, and eventually entire power systems. But transforming scientific discovery into practical technology required engineering, designing machines that could operate reliably, developing insulation and conductors, building systems that could generate, transmit, and distribute power over distances. The telegraph, the telephone, electric lighting, each represented not just invention but engineering implementation, solving problems of materials and manufacturing, of standards and interfaces. Samuel Morse's telegraph code was an engineering solution, a way to encode letters as combinations of dots and dashes, simple enough to be transmitted reliably over long wires where signals degraded with distance. Bridge building, too, entered a new era. The Brooklyn Bridge, completed in 1883, spanned nearly 1,600 feet between its towers, using steel cables from which the roadway was suspended. This was suspension bridge engineering at a new scale, requiring careful calculation of loads and stresses, understanding how wind and temperature changes would affect the structure, how to anchor cables securely, how to spin them from thousands of individual wires into coherent load-bearing elements. John Roebling, who designed the bridge, and his son Washington Roebling, who supervised its construction, had to solve problems no one had faced before. Washington spent hours in the compressed air of the caissons. The large chambers sunk into the riverbed to create foundations for the towers and suffered from decompression sickness. The bends, but the bridge was completed, a testament to engineering determination, to calculation married to courage. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the professionalization of engineering continue. Universities established engineering departments, professional societies formed, setting standards, publishing research, creating communities where engineers could share knowledge. The American Society of Civil Engineers, founded in 1852, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers in 1880, the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, born from earlier organizations, each creating forums for technical exchange. Engineering education became increasingly mathematical, drawing on advances in physics and mathematics. Thermodynamics was formalized, allowing engineers to calculate the efficiency of engines with precision. Fluid mechanics developed mathematical descriptions of flow. Structural mechanics applied calculus to the analysis of beams and frames. This theoretical foundation didn't replace practical experience, but it complemented it, allowing engineers to design with greater confidence, to push boundaries with better understanding of where those boundaries lay. The 20th century brought engineering to scales both vast and minute. Civil engineers built dams like the Hoover Dam, completed in 1936, a massive concrete structure that held back the Colorado River, creating Lake Mead, generating hydroelectric power, providing water for cities and irrigation for farms across the arid Southwest. Such projects required coordination of thousands of workers, delivery of millions of tons of material, and careful planning to pour concrete in sections, allowing each section to cure and cool before the next was added, preventing the cracks that would form if the entire mass tried to cool at once. Aerospace engineering emerged as the Wright brothers' first flights in 1903 gave way to more sophisticated aircraft. Understanding aerodynamics became crucial. The shape of wings, the angle of attack, the relationship between lift and drag. Wind tunnels allowed engineers to test designs, to visualize airflow over surfaces, to iterate and improve. And within decades, aircraft evolved from fragile wood and fabric constructions to metal machines capable of crossing oceans, of carrying hundreds of passengers. The space age pushed engineering into entirely new realms. Rockets that could escape Earth's gravity, spacecraft that could navigate the vacuum of space. The Apollo program, which put humans on the moon in 1969, required engineering across every discipline, mechanical systems that could function in extreme temperatures, electrical systems resistant to radiation, navigation systems of unprecedented precision, life support systems that could sustain astronauts for days in an environment utterly hostile to human life. Chemical engineering matured, enabling the synthesis of plastics, pharmaceuticals, fertilizers. The Haber-Bosch process, developed in the early 20th century, fixed nitrogen from the air, allowing the production of ammonia for fertilizer on industrial scales. This single innovation, making it possible to feed billions, represents engineering's power to reshape not just the landscape, but the fundamental conditions of human existence. Electronics miniaturized, from vacuum tubes to transistors to integrated circuits, each step an engineering challenge. How to manufacture components with features measured in millionths of a meter. How to ensure reliability when thousands, then millions, then billions of components were connected. How to design circuits that could compute, store information, communicate. The development of the microprocessor, the computer on a chip, enabled the digital revolution. And behind it lay decades of engineering refinement, of learning to control materials at atomic scales, to design systems of extraordinary complexity. And gradually, as the 20th century progressed and turned into the 21st, engineering began to grapple with new kinds of questions, not just what can be built, but what should be built, not just efficiency and performance, but sustainability and impact. The recognition that every structure, every system, every technology exists within larger contexts, ecological, social, economic, that engineering decisions ripple outward in ways that must be considered. The field of engineering, when viewed across the full arc of its history, reveals itself as something more than a collection of techniques, more than solutions to isolated problems. It is a conversation that has continued for thousands of years, each generation inheriting questions from the last, finding answers, and in the process, discovering new questions to pass forward. At its heart, engineering is about constraints, about working within the limits of materials and physics, of economics and time, about understanding that every design is a negotiation between what is desired and what is possible, between the ideal and the achievable, and finding in that space of compromise, of trade-offs, not resignation, but creativity, because constraints, rather than stifling imagination, often channel it, focus it, give it productive direction. Consider the arch again, that simple curve that appears in Roman aqueducts and Gothic cathedrals, in bridges spanning gorges and doorways framing entrances. It exists because stone is strong in compression, but weak in tension, because a flat stone beam spanning a gap will crack under its own weight, but stones arranged in an arch, each supporting its neighbors, each pressing against the others, create a structure that turns weakness into strength, that makes the material's limitations the foundation of its capability. This is engineering thinking, accepting what is, working with it rather than against it, finding forms that align with the nature of materials rather than fighting that nature. And from this acceptance comes elegance, structures that feel inevitable, that seem to have grown from their constraints rather than been imposed despite them. The great engineers throughout history have possessed this quality, the ability to see deeply into problems, to understand not just the surface requirements, but the underlying patterns, the essential relationships between forces and forms, between functions and shapes. They think in systems, recognizing that every element affects every other, that changing one parameter cascades through the design, and they develop intuition, a feel for how things will behave, that comes from experience but also from a kind of attentiveness, a patient observation of how the world works. There is mathematics in engineering, certainly, equations that describe stresses and flows, that predict behavior and calculate safety margins. But there is also something less quantifiable, a sense of rightness, of proportion and balance that experienced engineers develop. They can look at a design and feel whether it will work, whether the forces are properly resolved, whether the materials are well chosen, and this intuition, this engineering judgment, cannot be reduced to formulas. It emerges from the accumulated wisdom of doing, of building and testing, of failures learned from and successes understood. And engineering, unlike pure science, must always confront the reality of the implementation. An idea, no matter how brilliant in theory, is worthless if it cannot be built, if materials strong enough don't exist or are too expensive, if the skills required aren't available, if the time needed exceeds what circumstances allow. Engineering operates in the realm of the actual, the achievable, the real world, with all its friction and complexity and unpredictability. This is why engineering projects sometimes fail, despite careful planning and expert knowledge, because reality is messier than models, because unforeseen interactions emerge, because the ground is not quite what the survey indicated, because the steel delivered is not quite to specification, because weather or politics or economics intervene, and good engineers, while striving for success, also design for graceful degradation, for redundancy, for the possibility of the unexpected. They know that perfection is unattainable, that the goal is robustness, resilience, the ability to function well enough under real conditions that are never ideal. The categories of engineering that we recognize today: civil, mechanical, electrical, chemical, aerospace, biomedical, nuclear, computer, software, are relatively recent distinctions. For most of history, there were simply engineers, people who built things, who solved problems using whatever knowledge and tools were available. The specialization we see now reflects the explosion of knowledge, the deepening of understanding in each domain, until no single person can master everything. And so engineers focus, develop expertise in particular areas, but the underlying habits of mind, the ways of thinking that characterize engineering remain consistent across all these fields. Engineers think about failure mode, about what can go wrong. They ask what-if questions. What if the load is greater than expected? What if the temperature rises? What if the power fails? What if the operator makes a mistake? And they design accordingly, adding margins of safety, incorporating backup systems, creating designs that fail safely when they do fail, that degrade predictably rather than catastrophically. They think in iterations, recognizing that first attempts are rarely optimal. That design is a process of refinement, of testing and learning, of discovering through building what the next version should address. The history of any technology shows this clearly. From early automobiles to modern electric vehicles, from vacuum tubes to microchips, each generation building on the lessons of the last, incrementally improving, occasionally leaping forward when new principles are discovered or new materials become available. And increasingly, modern engineers think about systems, about how their work connects to larger wholes. A bridge is not just a structure, but part of a transportation network, a power plant, not just a generator, but a node in an electrical grid, a building not just a shelter, but an element in an urban ecosystem. This system's perspective, this recognition of interconnection, changes how engineering problems are framed, expanding the scope of consideration, requiring attention to interfaces and interactions, to emergent properties that arise only when components are combined. The future of engineering, if we can glimpse it at all, seems to involve both larger and smaller scales. Massive infrastructure projects to address climate change, to manage water resources, to enable sustainable energy systems, and simultaneously, engineering at molecular and atomic scales, designing materials with properties precisely tailored to applications, creating medicines that target specific cellular processes, building computing devices that approach the limits of physical law. It will involve new materials, composites and metamaterials with properties not found in nature. It will involve artificial intelligence as a tool for design and optimization, exploring solution spaces too vast for human minds to search exhaustively. It will involve greater attention to life cycle thinking, to the environmental costs of materials and manufacturing, to designing for disassembly and reuse rather than disposal. But beneath all these specific developments, the essence of engineering will likely remain what it has always been, the application of knowledge and creativity to make the world more suited to human needs, to solve problems, to build things that work, to transform understanding into artifact, theory into practice, imagination into reality. And now, as this long story finds its way toward conclusion, as we stand at this moment looking back across millennia of human ingenuity, it becomes clear that engineering is not separate from human culture, not merely a technical endeavor conducted by specialists, but woven into the fabric of how we live, how we organize ourselves, how we conceive of what is possible. Every bridge crossed, every road traveled, every building entered represents countless decisions by engineers, calculations made, materials chosen, details considered, most of this work invisible to those who benefit from it, infrastructure that functions so reliably it goes unnoticed until something fails and we suddenly remember how much we depend on systems we usually take for granted. the water that flows from a tap, the electricity that powers lights, the networks that carry communications, the vehicles that transport goods. All of these rely on engineering, on systems designed and built and maintained by people who understand, at least in their particular domain, how to make things work, how to keep them working, how to repair and improve them when needed. And perhaps this is engineering's deepest gift, not any particular structure or machine, but the demonstration that the world is not fixed, not immutable, that human beings can be active participants in shaping their environment, that problems, even enormous ones, can be broken down, understood, addressed through methodical application of knowledge and effort. The pyramids still stand in the desert. The Roman aqueducts still march across the countryside. Medieval cathedrals still soar, testament to engineering ambition and skill, but more than that, testament to the human capacity to envision what does not yet exist, and then, through patience and perseverance, through calculation and craft, to bring it into being. This is what engineers do. In every age, with whatever tools and materials their time provides, they look at the gap between what is and what could be, and they figure out how to bridge it, not through magic or wishful thinking, but through understanding, through careful attention to how the world works, through respect for physical law, combined with determination to find what those laws permit. And tonight, in this quiet moment, we can appreciate the long arc of that endeavor, from the first stone tools to the satellites overhead, from irrigation canals to computer networks, from monuments built to honor gods to systems designed to sustain billions of human lives, all of it connected, all of it part of the same fundamental impulse, to understand, to build, to make, to engineer. The word returns ingenium, cleverness, the innate quality that allows one to devise, to construct, to transform. And we see it expressed across cultures, across centuries, in forms as different as ziggurats and suspension bridges, as aqueducts and microchips, but united by common threads, by the engineering way of thinking, by the commitment to making ideas tangible, knowledge useful, understanding practical. The night deepens, thoughts drift like leaves on a slow current, and somewhere engineers are working, designing, calculating, testing, solving the problems of tomorrow with tools and principles inherited from yesterday, carrying forward that ancient conversation, adding their voices, their insights, their solutions to the long record of human making, and in that continuity, that unbroken chain of problems posed and answered, of challenges met and overcome, of knowledge accumulated and applied, there is something profoundly reassuring, a reminder that we are not alone, not isolated in our time, but connected to all those who came before, who faced their challenges with the materials and understanding available to them, who built what they could and left it for us to build upon. The story, like all stories, must end. But the thing it describes, the field of engineering, the practice of applied knowledge, the art of making the world, continues, evolving, adapting, addressing new challenges, finding new possibilities, and it will continue long after these words fade, as long as there are problems to solve, structures to build, systems to design, as long as there are minds that look at what is and imagine what could be, and hands willing to do the work of transformation. the silence settles, gentle and complete. And in that silence, all the structures ever built, all the systems ever designed, all the problems ever solved through engineering thought and effort, rest quietly, holding their shapes, performing their functions, testaments in stone and steel and silicon to the enduring human capacity to understand, to create, to engineer,